The question of whether the Trojan War was chronologically misplaced requires investigation not only into archaeological evidence and textual interpretation, but also into the mechanisms of how time itself is constructed within historiography. The traditional date of the Trojan War, most commonly assigned to around 1200 BCE, rests on a network of assumptions built over centuries, but rarely interrogated through the lens of political or theological manipulation. This investigation opens with a critical framing of the problem, not whether the Trojan War happened, nor whether Homer was historically accurate, but whether the entire apparatus that gave the Trojan War its place in time may have been deliberately or systematically distorted. Chronological certainty in ancient history is a fragile construct. Before the adoption of absolute dating methods like radiocarbon and dendrochronology, ancient events were synchronized through literary reference points, genealogies, and king lists. These systems were prone to telescoping, duplication, and invention. The Trojan War sits at the boundary between myth and history, making it vulnerable to being co-opted into constructed chronologies. A war whose participants include gods, demigods, and epic heroes lends itself to symbolic reconstruction. Yet this very ambiguity made it ideal for political and religious forces who sought to anchor their legitimacy in an ancient but selectively remembered past. This investigation operates on three assumptions. First, that history can be retrofitted through interpretative layering. Second, that power structures, whether dynastic, religious, or ideological, have a vested interest in controlling time. And third, that texts such as Homer's Iliad are not inert records but living instruments of manipulation. These assumptions do not presuppose a single conspiracy or motive, but rather a systemic tendency in civilizations to reorder time to serve the present. The Greeks themselves were not operating under a unified historical consciousness. Mycenaean civilization collapsed long before the Archaic period, leaving behind material remains but no continuous written narrative. The oral traditions that preserved stories of Achilles and Hector were molded by hundreds of years of retelling. By the time Homeric epics were committed to writing in the 8th century BCE, they were already products of a reconstructed past. This reconstruction, we must ask, may not have been neutral. Was the fixing of Homer's tales to a particular era part of a larger ideological program? Did statesmen, scholars, or religious authorities in subsequent centuries redate these events to align with new myths of origin? To pursue this question requires decentering the Iliad as a work of literature and recasting it as a chronological anchor within classical and post-classical identity. The Iliad functions not only as cultural memory, but as a pseudo-historical device. Its characters are mapped onto genealogies, its war is dated in relation to other known events, and its narrative arc is made to fit a linear progression of Greek development from Bronze Age warrior societies to democratic city-states. But what if this progression itself was fabricated? The suspicion deepens when one examines the emergence of systematized chronology in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Before this systematization, time was fluid, relative, and often cyclical. Afterward, it became increasingly linear and interlinked with broader attempts to coordinate diverse traditions into coherent imperial or theological narratives. The dating of the Trojan War may have been solidified during this process, transforming a floating myth into a fixed historical point, not because evidence demanded it, but because ideology did. The goal of this investigation is not to refute the Trojan War, but to destabilize the certainty with which it is placed in history. The evidence-based textual, archaeological, and astronomical does not unanimously affirm the conventional dating. Rather, it reveals fractures, contradictions, and silences. These absences are as important as presences. They suggest that history, as received, has been curated. Understanding this curation means tracing the evolution of how the Trojan War was used. In archaic Greece, it served to bind aristocratic identities to heroic ancestries. In classical Athens, it provided moral and political lessons. In Hellenistic Alexandria, it was subsumed into a broader narrative of Greek superiority and intellectual dominance. In imperial Rome, it became a founding myth. In the Christian world, it was reinterpreted to fit a theological framework of world history. Each iteration required chronological embedding. Each demanded a date. That date supposedly based on genealogical synchronisms, Olympiad reckoning, and astronomical correlations may not reflect historical truth, but ideological necessity. This section, then, serves as the foundation for a systematic inquiry into the mechanisms of chronological control. Each subsequent section will focus on a specific line of investigation, from the archaeology of Troy to the literary politics of Homeric transcription, from Alexandrian scholarship to Christian historiography. The investigation is interdisciplinary, but unified by a critical stance that the past is not merely recorded, but constructed. Not merely interpreted, but organized in time by those with power to define what counts as history. The investigation also refrains from affirming any alternate date prematurely. It does not claim the Trojan War happened in a different century. Rather, it asks whether the frameworks used to date it deserve trust. If they do not, then the burden shifts to those who uphold traditional chronology to prove its integrity. Until then, we must consider the unsettling possibility that one of the most iconic wars of antiquity may have never occurred, at least not when or how we have been told. The dating of the Trojan War is typically fixed around the 12th or 13th century BCE, most often cited as circa 1194 to 1184 BCE. This range, widely accepted in classical scholarship, is not based on contemporary records of the war, but on reconstructions from much later sources. The roots of this chronology are complex, built from a combination of literary tradition, later Greek chronographers, and attempts to synchronize Greek events with the histories of neighboring civilizations. However, none of these sources are contemporaneous with the war itself, and each brings assumptions that merit critical scrutiny. The earliest attempt to date the Trojan War with numerical precision comes from later Greek writers, particularly Eratosthenes, who calculated the war's start as 1193 BCE. He did so centuries after the supposed event, relying on oral traditions, genealogical lists, and inferred regnal lengths. These calculations were embedded in a framework that sought to create a continuous history from mythic times to the present of Hellenistic scholars. Yet Eratosthenes' methodology was more interpretive than empirical, and his result was accepted not due to definitive evidence, but because it filled a vacuum and gave scholars a working chronology. Additional support for this date came from historians, such as Apollodorus of Athens and the chronographer Castor of Rhodes, who relied heavily on the same tradition-bound materials. Their reconstructions often involved extrapolating the dates of the war by calculating backwards from known historical events, such as the First Olympiad, 776 BCE, and assigning fixed intervals to mythic periods. This reverse engineering assumed uniform generation lengths and accepted mythic genealogies as literal. Such assumptions introduce significant opportunities for error and fabrication, especially when the source material was oral, poetic, or highly symbolic. The canonical dating of the Trojan War further solidified during the Roman era, particularly as Roman historians seeking to link their origins to Troy through Aeneas required a firm temporal anchor for the war. In doing so, they legitimized a timeline that retroactively served political purposes. The dating became canon, not because it was proven, but because it was needed. Once Rome appropriated Troy as its mythical origin, the Trojan War had to be placed far enough in the past to avoid contradictions with Roman imperial timelines and biblical chronologies. Outside the Greek tradition, attempts to synchronize the war with Near Eastern chronologies, such as Egyptian or Hittite records, face similar complications. The identification of Ahiawa with the Achaeans and Wilusa with Troy, for instance, has led scholars to propose correlations with Hittite records. However, the correspondences are speculative and rely on linguistic parallels and ambiguous textual references. Moreover, the dating of the Hittite New Kingdom itself is not beyond dispute and is subject to revision based on new archaeological and astronomical evidence. Thus, any synchronization is provisional and circular when used to reinforce the traditional date of the Trojan War. Archaeological attempts to ground the date in material remains have largely centered on Hizarlik, the site identified as ancient Troy. The destruction layers at this site, particularly Troy Vi and Troy Via, have been proposed as candidates for the Homeric War. Troy VI was destroyed around 1300 BCE, while Troy VIIA suffered destruction in the late 12th century BCE. While these layers roughly coincide with the literary date, the archaeological evidence remains ambiguous. The destruction could have been due to earthquake, internal collapse, or regional conflict unrelated to a Pan-Aegean war. There is no clear indication of a large-scale Greek coalition or any cultural imprint that links the remains definitively to Homer's narrative. The credibility of the traditional date is further weakened by the evolution of Greek literacy and record-keeping. Homeric poems were not written down until the 8th century BCE, over 400 years after the proposed date of the war. This gap implies several centuries of oral transmission during which changes, insertions, and chronological repositioning could occur. It is during this period that the Trojan War likely transformed from a local memory or legend into a civilizational cornerstone. The dating in this context would not reflect historical memory but a cultural invention calibrated to serve emerging Greek identities. That this date became widely accepted is as much a product of consensus building as of critical assessment. Once embedded in education, literature, and imperial ideology, it became resistant to revision. Successive generations inherited the date as a given, not as a hypothesis. Even modern scholarship, despite improved tools for historical reconstruction, often perpetuates the Eratosthenean chronology through inertia and institutional tradition. In evaluating the standard date of the Trojan War, one must recognize that it emerges from secondary and tertiary traditions rather than primary documentation. The precision of 1194 to 1184 BCE gives an illusion of historical certainty that the evidence does not justify. It is a constructed date, not a discovered one, a date chosen because it fit into an already accepted narrative framework. The deeper issue is not the war's historicity, but the function of its dating. The Trojan War's placement in time serves to demarcate the end of a heroic age and the transition into the historical period of city-states, colonization, and ultimately classical Greece. This placement provides cultural continuity and a usable past. The function of this chronology deserves greater scrutiny. It elevates Homer to the status of proto-historian and places the origins of Greek civilization in a time of mythical grandeur. It bridges the gap between divine myth and human history. But in doing so, it collapses the boundary between storytelling and historiography. The Trojan War becomes a historical skeleton key, a moment that unlocks subsequent timelines. If the key is flawed, then the entire chronological edifice requires re-examination. This section has outlined the sources and reasoning behind the traditional date of the Trojan War. It demonstrates that the accepted timeline relies on retrospective calculations, ideological motivations, and uncritical synthesis of incompatible sources. The next section will examine how the oral nature of Homer's epics contributes to chronological ambiguity, and permits manipulation over time. The transmission of the Iliad and Odyssey through oral tradition is central to understanding the fluidity of the Trojan War's dating. Unlike modern historical records anchored in fixed, verifiable dates, Homeric epics were shaped by generations of oral performance long before being committed to writing. This mode of transmission introduces significant chronological instability. The epics did not originate in a single historical moment, but evolved over centuries, absorbing new political, social, and ideological layers as they were recited by bards across the Aegean world. Oral tradition operates through formulaic repetition, mnemonic devices, and episodic structures that facilitate memory. These characteristics enable stories to persist, but also render them susceptible to transformation. Each recitation is an act of interpretation. Bards adjusted content for their audiences, updated language, altered emphasis, and inserted references that reflected contemporary concerns. Over generations, such modifications accumulate, producing versions that differ markedly from their supposed origins. Thus, what may have begun as a memory of a local conflict or a set of heroic tales could be reshaped into a pan-Hellenic myth situated in an imagined past. This transformation is not arbitrary. Oral narratives serve social functions. They preserve identity, transmit values, and legitimize political structures. As Greek city-states emerged from the so-called Dark Ages, the epics provided a shared cultural foundation. But in fulfilling this function, the stories were recontextualized. Their timeline became aligned with the political and religious needs of their new hosts. It is during this fluid, centuries-long phase that the events of the Trojan War could be redated, whether consciously or unconsciously, to suit the evolving Greek world. The lack of a writing system during the initial transmission period further complicates the situation. Linear B, the script used by Mycenaeans, disappeared with the collapse of their palatial centers around 1200 BCE. For approximately 4 centuries afterward, there was no known writing system in use in Greece. This period, often called the Greek Dark Age, leaves a gap between the Mycenaean world and the literate Archaic period. The Homeric poems were committed to writing only in the 8th century BCE, likely in Ionian centers such as Chios or Smyrna, using the newly imported Phoenician alphabet. By then, the original events, if they occurred, had already passed into the realm of myth and were mediated through oral refo, rmul, ation. The delay between the supposed events and the earliest textual recording undermines any confidence in precise chronology. Oral narratives are not concerned with exact dates or historical sequencing. They are structured around themes, archetypes, and heroic cycles. Time in such narratives is elastic. Decades may collapse into moments, and mythic figures may be transposed across eras. Anchoring such stories to a specific historical date requires imposing a framework foreign to their original function. Furthermore, the oral nature of the epics allowed for external influence over time. As political regimes changed, so too did the emphasis within the stories. The elevation of certain heroes, the demonization of others, and the framing of battles could shift. As a result, the Trojan War narrative became a palimpsest, a layered text where traces of earlier versions coexist with later ideological overlays. These overlays could include chronologizing motifs, designed to place the war within a broader historical sequence. The possibility of intentional chronological distortion cannot be excluded. During the Archaic and Classical periods, rival city-states competed for cultural dominance. Claims to Homeric lineage, whether through descent from heroes, association with battle sites, or custodianship of epic tradition, became tools of prestige. Placing the war in a remote past enhanced the legitimacy of those who claimed continuity with that age. Conversely, bringing it too close to contemporary times risked undermining its mythic grandeur. The chosen date had to balance credibility with exaltation. Even after the epics were written down, the process of standardization did not eliminate variation. Multiple textual traditions circulated simultaneously. The so-called Pisistraton recension, attributed to the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus in the 6th century BCE, may have sought to canonize the Iliad and Odyssey to fit Athenian ideological goals. This version, which later became dominant, likely fixed certain chronological markers. The fact that this standardization occurred within a specific political context further undermines claims of objectivity. The Homeric texts became tools of statecraft, and their internal chronology adjusted accordingly. Even within the epics themselves, chronological inconsistencies abound. The duration of the war is vaguely defined. References to earlier and later events fluctuate. Genealogical links contradict known timelines. These features reflect the oral origins of the texts and resist precise placement in historical time. Yet rather than treating this ambiguity as a signal to remain cautious, later scholars imposed artificial coherence, attempting to fix the epics within a linear historical model. The consequences of this imposition are profound. It locks a fluid narrative into a rigid frame. It obscures the multi-layered evolution of the epics. And it creates the illusion of historical certainty where none exists. This process not only affects the Trojan War's dating but also distorts our understanding of the transition from myth to history in Greek consciousness. By examining the mechanisms of oral transmission, it becomes clear that the Homeric epics cannot be treated as fixed historical sources. Their fluidity, adaptability, and ideological utility made them prime candidates for chronological repositioning. Whether this repositioning occurred gradually through accretive storytelling or was guided by specific agendas, the result is the same. The Trojan War, as presented in Homer, is not anchored in historical time but floats within a constructed past tailored to suit later cultural needs. The implications extend beyond literary criticism. They force a re-evaluation of all chronological models that depend on the Iliad and Odyssey as reference points. If the epics themselves resist dating, then the historical timelines built upon them lack foundation. In the next section we will examine how classical Greece, particularly Athens, capitalized on Homer to construct political legitimacy, and in doing so, potentially contributed to fixing the Trojan War within a politically convenient past. In classical Greece, particularly in Athens, Homeric texts became more than cultural artifacts. They were transformed into tools of civic ideology and political legitimacy. The Iliad and Odyssey were embedded into educational systems, ritual performances, and civic festivals, providing a narrative reservoir from which city-states could extract prestige and identity. Athens, with its democratic ambitions and imperial aspirations, led this instrumentalization of Homer. The manipulation of Homeric material in this period extended beyond content and into chronology, subtly shifting the war's temporal placement to align with the political imperatives of the present. Homer's works became central to the Panathenaic festivals in Athens, particularly after the reforms attributed to the tyrant Pisistratus in the 6th century BCE. These festivals featured rhapsodic recitations of the epics, which were likely standardized during this period. The so-called Pisistraton recension involved the collection, editing, and possible interpolation of Homeric verses. Though the full extent of editorial intervention is debated, what is not in question is the role of the state in overseeing and preserving the authoritative version of Homer. When a political regime curates a national epic, the risk of ideological distortion, including chronological repositioning, is non-trivial. The elevation of Athens as a Homeric custodian served multiple purposes. First, it positioned the city as the inheritor of the heroic age, not merely a participant in the present. but a link to a glorious, semi-divine past. Second, it enabled Athenian elites to trace their genealogies back to Homeric heroes, a form of manufactured aristocratic legitimacy. Third, and most relevant to chronology, it permitted the anchoring of civic myths within an ostensibly historical framework. The war, once placed at a fixed point in the distant past, became a usable event through which Athens could define its temporal and moral trajectory. This use of Homer for political ends required selective emphasis. Characters were highlighted or marginalized depending on how well they aligned with contemporary values. Achilles, a paragon of individual glory and rage, became a complex symbol in a city espousing collective virtue and legal institutions. Odysseus, often portrayed as cunning and ambiguous, was alternately celebrated or distrusted, depending on political context. These interpretive shifts, made in the context of performance and pedagogy, were not limited to character. They extended to time. The Trojan War's placement had to be distant enough to be mythic, yet proximate enough to feel genealogically relevant. This balancing act enabled Athens to draw a continuous arc from the age of heroes to its own moment. The war could not be too recent, lest it appear pedestrian, nor too remote, lest it become irrelevant. A chronological consensus gradually emerged, not out of discovery, but out of narrative necessity. The chosen era, approximately 12th century BCE, was distant, yet plausible, conveniently preceding the so-called Dark Age, which provided a buffer. A forgotten time where myth and history could intermingle without contradiction. Athenian dramatists and historians further reinforced this temporal framework. Tragedians like Euripides and Sophocles revisited Trojan characters and events, embedding them within ethical debates that reflected Athenian civic dilemmas. Though set in a distant past, these plays projected contemporary concerns onto Homeric figures. In doing so, they retrofitted the Trojan War with moral and political significance appropriate for classical audiences. Meanwhile, historians such as Herodotus and Thucydides situated Homer within broader historical narratives, treating his work as both cultural myth and proto-history. Herodotus explicitly referenced the Trojan War as a real event, anchoring it within his inquiries and timelines. While he acknowledged the mythical elements of the epics, he nevertheless attempted to reconcile them with known events and genealogies. This reconciliation implicitly endorsed the war's dating and perpetuated the illusion of continuity. Thucydides, more skeptical, questioned the scale and unity of the war, suggesting it was exaggerated. However, he did not reject its historicity or challenge its placement in time. Instead, he used it to critique contemporary warfare, inadvertently legitimizing its role in the historical continuum. In this environment, the dating of the Trojan War became self-reinforcing. Each retelling, commentary, and institutional performance solidified its placement. The war's supposed date was no longer an open question, but an inherited truth. Its position in time became as unquestioned as its moral lessons. The epics had moved from oral tradition into the framework of state ideology, and their chronology was pulled along with them. Athens was not alone in this process. Other city-states, including Sparta and Argos, also claimed Homeric lineage. However, Athens' cultural dominance ensured that its version of Homer and its chronological implications became hegemonic. The inclusion of Homeric tales in educational curricula, often starting from youth, ingrained these temporal assumptions at the foundational level of civic identity. Philosophers, rhetoricians, and lawmakers all drew from Homer, ensuring that his world remained temporally and ideologically present. This temporal domestication of the Trojan War also served to position Greek civilization as the inheritor of an unbroken heroic legacy. The distance between myth and democracy, between Achilles and Pericles, was collapsed. History became a straight line, not a rupture. In this sense, The placement of the Trojan War was not merely a matter of historiographical interest but of civilizational self-definition. Yet this construction masked deep discontinuities. The Greek Dark Age represents a period of massive upheaval and cultural collapse. No continuous political structures, writing systems, or institutional traditions survived from the Mycenaean world into classical Greece. The gap is not merely chronological, it is civilizational. Placing the Trojan War just before this rupture served to conceal the discontinuity. It allowed for a smooth narrative, where Greek identity could be traced without interruption. This concealment is inherently ideological. The strategic utility of this positioning calls into question the motives behind the war's accepted date. It suggests that the date is not the product of forensic reconstruction, but of mythic curation. It emerged not from critical evaluation of evidence, but from centuries of repetition under institutional sponsorship. Its endurance owes more to political expediency than historical rigor. This section has shown how classical Greece, particularly Athens, used Homer and the Trojan War's dating to construct a politically useful past. The next section will examine how Hellenistic scholars like Eratosthenes systematized this mythology into chronological fact, further reinforcing the illusion of historical continuity. The standardization of Greek chronology during the Hellenistic period marks a turning point in the institutionalization of myth as historical fact. Central to this process was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a polymath based at the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. Eratosthenes is credited with producing one of the first comprehensive chronological systems of Greek history, including a precise dating of the Trojan War. His approach combined literary tradition, regnal lists, mythic genealogies, Olympiad records, and inferred generational spans. The result was a system that offered apparent precision but was structurally speculative. It masked conjecture with numerical clarity. Eratosthenes calculated that the Trojan War began in 1193 BCE and ended in 1184 BCE. These dates were not extracted from contemporary documentation but were instead retroactively computed from more recent, fixed points, such as the first Olympiad in 776 BC, and extended backward using standard generational intervals, typically 33 years per generation. This method, while seemingly rational, was based on abstract modeling rather than direct evidence. It assumed not only the validity of mythical genealogies, but also the regularity of generational spans and the historical accuracy of epic tradition. His chronology was not unique in its intent, but in its influence. Previous chronographers had attempted similar calculations, but Eratosthenes' institutional affiliation at the Library of Alexandria gave his system authoritative reach. The library was more than a repository of texts, it was a project of imperial knowledge control under the Ptolemies. Within its halls, Greek history was being reconciled with Egyptian traditions, Babylonian astronomy, and emerging philosophical cosmologies. The task was to harmonize disparate timelines into a unified worldview. Eratosthenes' chronological system functioned as a tool for this harmonization. In the context of Alexandria, where Hellenistic rulers claimed both Greek and Egyptian legitimacy, a coherent and continuous Greek past was politically advantageous. The dating of the Trojan War became a cornerstone of this narrative. It allowed Greek identity to be rooted in a mythic antiquity that rivaled or exceeded the claims of older civilizations. The assignment of a specific date, like 1184 BCE, gave the illusion of temporal superiority. It placed Greek myth in alignment with the grand histories of the Near East, enabling Greek scholars to assert parity with Mesopotamian and Egyptian chronologies. Eratosthenes' calculations also coincided with a growing tendency in Hellenistic thought to rationalize mythology. This rationalization involved transforming gods into ancient kings, explaining miracles as natural events, and interpreting epics as veiled history. The dating of the Trojan War followed this trajectory. By treating Homer's stories as historical records rather than symbolic narratives, Eratosthenes contributed to a broader epistemological shift, the conversion of myth into pseudo-history. This rationalization process served intellectual and ideological functions. It provided a bridge between the poetic past and the empirical present. It enabled scholars to speak of Achilles and Hector not as literary constructs, but as historical figures. It allowed for a timeline where epic events seamlessly led to historical developments, including the rise of city-states, colonization, and empire. This continuity reinforced Greek cultural dominance in a multi-ethnic empire. It also allowed the Ptolemaic regime to position itself as inheritors of a grand and ancient tradition. Yet the chronological certainty Eratosthenes claimed was illusory. His system depended on the uncritical acceptance of mythic data, inconsistent genealogies, and arbitrary conversion metrics. For instance, he relied on the succession of the priestesses of Hera at Argos, a list used by earlier chronographers, but which contained obvious interpolations and mythical entries. He also employed the list of the kings of Sparta, which modern scholarship has shown to include duplicated and fabricated names to maintain dynastic continuity. Despite these flaws, Eratosthenes' dates became canonical. The authority of Eratosthenes' system was reinforced not by its accuracy, but by its institutional context. The Library of Alexandria, under royal patronage, represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic scholarship. Its conclusions carried weight across the Mediterranean. Later writers, including Roman historians and early Christian chronographers, adopted Eratosthenes' framework, further embedding his chronology into the foundations of Western historical consciousness that thought the consequences of this systematization were far-reaching. By fixing the Trojan War within a rigid timeline, later interpretations of history had to conform to its implications. Any archaeological, textual, or astronomical evidence that contradicted this placement was either reinterpreted or ignored. The dating became an axiom rather than a hypothesis. Historical events in the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant were sequenced around the Trojan benchmark, creating a chronological cascade that structured the ancient world. Moreover, the success of Eratosthenes' system set a precedent. It demonstrated that chronological frameworks, once codified by institutional authority, could override empirical uncertainty. This model would be replicated in later historical systems, including Roman annalistic historiography and Christian world chronologies. The Trojan War, in this respect, became the prototype for how myth could be transformed into historical anchor. Points by editorial fiat. This process raises fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and power. The dating of the Trojan War is not merely a scholarly issue. It reflects the capacity of intellectual institutions to shape collective memory. When myth is stabilized by calculation and institutional endorsement, it acquires the appearance of fact. Yet beneath this appearance lies a scaffold of speculation and ideological purpose. The chronological system of Eratosthenes, while impressive in scope, must be understood as a construct serving both academic rationalism and imperial ambition. Its precision is deceptive. Its acceptance was driven not by evidentiary robustness, but by the authority of those who propagated it. This recognition calls for a re-evaluation of all ancient chronologies built upon its model. The next section will examine the broader project of synchronizing Greek timelines with Near Eastern records, a process that reveals additional layers of artificial alignment and chronological manipulation. Efforts to synchronize Greek chronology with Near Eastern timelines represent one of the most ambitious undertakings in ancient historiography. These attempts, initiated primarily during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, sought to integrate the mythic history of Greece, most notably the Trojan War, into the broader historical frameworks of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Hittite Empire. The purpose of this alignment was twofold: to affirm the antiquity of Greek civilization relative to its Eastern counterparts, and to create a universal chronological system that merged disparate cultural narratives into a coherent temporal grid. However, the methodologies and assumptions underlying this synchronization reveal more about ideological motivations than historical accuracy. The primary challenge in aligning Greek and Near Eastern chronologies lies in the fundamentally different nature of their sources. Near Eastern records, particularly those from Egypt and Mesopotamia, were administrative, ritualistic, and calendrical in function. They often featured dated inscriptions, king lists, astronomical records, and temple archives. In contrast, Greek history, especially in its early phases, was preserved through oral epic, genealogical myth, and retrospective calculation. Synchronization thus required interpreting metaphorical narratives as literal events, and then mapping them onto empirically grounded timelines. One of the earliest and most cited correlations is the proposed identification of the Achaeans with the Ahiyawa in Hittite texts. Hittite records from the 13th century BCE mention a people known as Ahiyawa, often interpreted as a Western power with Mycenaean links. Similarly, Wilusa is frequently equated with Troy, based on phonetic resemblance and geographic indicators. These correlations, while tantalizing, rest on assumptions that are neither universally accepted nor definitively proven. The linguistic match is plausible but not conclusive, and the geographic data is fragmentary. Even if the identifications are accepted, the leap from naming to dating is problematic. The Hittite records place interactions with Ahiyawa and Wilusa. In the 13th century, particularly under kings such as Hattusili III and Tudhaliya IV, these encounters, framed as diplomatic exchanges or conflicts, are specific in context but vague in implications. The records do not describe a pan-Aegean war resembling Homer's Iliad, nor do they reference any event resembling a 10-year siege. At best, they describe regional tensions, shifting alliances, and limited engagements. The assumption that these records document a historical Trojan War is speculative, and the effort to align these entries with Eratosthenes' dating of 1193 to 1184 BCE reflects more of a desire for validation than a convergence of evidence. Egyptian sources present similar difficulties. Attempts to link the Trojan War to the chronology of New Kingdom pharaohs often focus on correlating mythic Greek figures with Egyptian diplomatic contacts. One example involves the Amarna letters, a cache of 14th century BCE correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and foreign rulers. Some scholars have proposed identifying names within these letters with figures from Greek myth, though the connections are tenuous. There is no explicit mention of the Trojan War or its protagonists in any Egyptian source. The broader approach has been to locate the war within the reigns of Ramses II or Merneptah, simply because their reigns are well dated and fall near the traditional range assigned to the war. The issue deepens with Mesopotamian chronologies. Babylonian and Assyrian king lists, eclipse records, and temple inscriptions provide a relatively stable temporal structure, extending into the 2nd millennium BCE. Greek scholars in the Hellenistic period sought to reconcile these timelines with their own, often by back-calculating from known astronomical events such as lunar eclipses or planetary conjunctions. This approach involved aligning Greek mythic dates with Babylonian records of celestial phenomena. But the reliability of this method depends entirely on interpreting mythic events as correlatable to astronomical ones, an epistemological stretch that transforms symbolic storytelling into supposed empirical observation. Furthermore, the effort to align timelines across cultures assumed a continuity of timekeeping and historical consciousness that did not exist. Greek chronological frameworks were not only different in structure, but developed centuries after the events they attempt to date. Near Eastern records used regnal years and dynastic periods, while the Greeks retrofitted Olympiads, genealogies, and mythic sequences onto a linear historical frame. Bridging these systems required constructing points of contact, most of which were highly speculative and often driven by ideological motivations. This synchronization was not a neutral academic exercise. It was a cultural assertion. Greek scholars, working under Hellenistic regimes, sought to place their own history on equal footing with that of Egypt and Babylon. The Trojan War, framed as a grand civilizational conflict, had to be situated in a period of comparable Near Eastern grandeur. The 13th century BCE, an era of international diplomacy, imperial expansion, and regional upheaval, provided a suitable backdrop. Placing the Trojan War in this period elevated its status, aligning it with the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the late New Kingdom in Egypt, and the supposed onslaught of the Sea Peoples. This narrative coherence was appealing but constructed. The dangers of this synchronization are significant. Once mythic events are dated based on tentative linguistic correlations or vague historical parallels, they begin to influence interpretations of material evidence. Archaeological strata are reassigned, historical figures are reinterpreted, and literary texts are mined for anachronistic clues. Rather than letting evidence guide conclusions, scholars become tempted to fit data into a predetermined chronological mold. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle in which flawed synchronizations validate each other. Even modern scholarship has inherited aspects of this framework. While new methods such as radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology have refined Near Eastern timelines, many reconstructions of the Greek Bronze Age still anchor themselves to the Trojan War, data signed by Eratosthenes and reinforced by these early synchronizations. The Trojan War continues to act as a chronological keystone, despite the growing recognition of its questionable historicity. Ultimately, the synchronization of Greek and Near Eastern chronologies reflects more about the aspirations of Hellenistic and early Roman scholars than about the historical realities of the late Bronze Age. It reveals a desire to create a unified history that could place Greek civilization at the heart of a global narrative. This required locating the Trojan War not where the evidence pointed, but where it best served the myth of continuity, prestige, and cultural centrality. In the next section, we will turn to the archaeological site most commonly associated with the Trojan War, Hazarlik, and examine whether material evidence supports the war's traditional dating or whether it exposes further chronological manipulation. The archaeological site of Hazarlik in northwestern Anatolia is widely accepted as the probable location of ancient Troy, excavated since the 19th century. Beginning with Heinrich Schliemann and later continued by Wilhelm Dürpfeld, Karl Blegen, and more recently Manfred Korfmann and others, the site has revealed multiple layers of settlement spanning thousands of years. Among these layers, Troy Vi and Troy Via are most frequently associated with the Trojan War. Yet despite decades of excavation, no definitive archaeological evidence has emerged that confirms a historical war corresponding to Homer's account. The discrepancies between the material record and the literary tradition raise fundamental doubts about the integrity of the traditional chronology. Troy Via, destroyed around 1300 BCE, is notable for its impressive fortifications, large-scale urban planning, and extensive trade connections. It presents a prosperous city that would plausibly match Homer's depiction of a wealthy, strategically important Troy. However, there is no clear evidence of destruction by war. The destruction layer is widely attributed to an earthquake, not human conflict. There are no signs of widespread burning, siege warfare, or mass casualties typically associated with military devastation. Moreover, the artifacts and structures uncovered do not reflect a society in the midst of or preparing for a prolonged conflict involving a pan-Aegean coalition. Troy VII destroyed around 1190 to 1180 BCE, aligns more closely with the traditional Eratosthenian dating of the Trojan War. This layer does show signs of destruction by fire and possible conflict. Defensive measures appear to have been hastily reinforced, and storage jars indicate attempts to prepare for siege conditions. Yet the scale and character of the destruction remain ambiguous. The signs of warfare are not necessarily indicative of a decade-long siege involving multiple Greek kings. They could reflect regional conflict, piracy, or internal upheaval during a period of broader societal collapse across the eastern Mediterranean. The transition from Troy Vi to Veii complicates the narrative. The later settlement was smaller, poorer, and less architecturally refined than its predecessor. If the Trojan War was meant to have occurred during a time of glory and prosperity as described in Homer, then Troy Vi fits the image better. But its destruction predates the traditional date of the war by several decades. Conversely, Troy VIA fits the timeline but not the grandeur. The mismatch between the archaeological strata and the literary description suggests either an error in dating or a misunderstanding of the war's scale and significance. Beyond the immediate material evidence, broader archaeological context fails to corroborate a war of Homeric proportions. Excavations at Mycenaean centers such as Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae show signs of destruction around the end of the 13th century BCE, but these events appear uncoordinated and internally driven. There is no evidence of a massive overseas military campaign by the Mycenaean world. The lack of standardized military artifacts, logistics infrastructure, or consistent ceramic links across sites further undermines the idea of a united Greek expedition against Troy. Even more problematic is the absence of Pan-Aegean war memorials or commemorative structures. If the Trojan War had been a foundational event of Greek unity, one would expect to find monumental expressions of its legacy tombs, offerings, dedications dated to the generations following the war. Instead, the archaeological record is marked by cultural regression, depopulation, and loss of writing systems. This disconnect suggests that the Trojan War, if it occurred at all, did not leave the kind of enduring imprint typical of major historical conflicts. The continuity of settlement at Hazarlik after the supposed war further complicates matters. Troy VIIB continued into the Iron Age with no indication of prolonged abandonment or cultural rupture. This contradicts the idea of a city annihilated by Greek forces and left in ruins, as implied by the Iliad and later epic traditions. The absence of a break in occupation suggests that the war narrative, at least as a catastrophic and final conflict, was retroactively imposed on a more complex and gradual historical process. Scholarly attempts to reconcile these gaps often rely on selective interpretation. Some propose that Homer conflated multiple wars across centuries into a single narrative. Others argue that the war was symbolic or representative of a class of conflicts rather than a singular event. While these theories offer flexibility, they do little to support a precise historical date for the war. Instead, they highlight the degree to which the traditional chronology depends on accepting a mythic narrative as a literal historical account. More radical interpretations suggest that the identification of Hazarlik as Troy is itself mistaken or overly simplistic. While the site clearly shows evidence of significant Bronze Age urbanization, the geographic details in Homer are vague and inconsistent. The Iliad describes a city near the sea, with specific topographies that do not align perfectly with Hazarlik's landscape. Some scholars have posited alternative locations for Troy, from the southern coast of Anatolia to Thrace, though none have gained consensus. The uncertainty of Troy's exact location further undermines confidence in any associated chronological claims. The archaeological silence is perhaps most deafening in its failure to confirm any historical memory of the war within the material. Culture of the Late Bronze Age. No inscriptions, tablets, or local narratives from the Mycenaean or Hittite worlds reference a war resembling Homer's epic. This absence is notable given the bureaucratic sophistication of both civilizations, which maintained detailed records of even minor events. If the Trojan War had been a major geopolitical event, it is statistically improbable that no contemporary records would mention it. Instead, the war enters the historical consciousness through oral tradition many centuries after its supposed occurrence. By the time it is written down, it is already embedded in a mythic framework. This temporal gap allows for the insertion of ideological agendas, recontextualizations, and chronological manipulations. The archaeological record, far from corroborating the war, resists its narrative structure and temporal placement. What emerges from a sober analysis of the site at Hisarlik is a layered history of urban development, destruction, and continuity, none of which aligns cleanly with the literary construct of the Trojan War. The temptation to force a match between Troy v. Aia and Homer's narrative reflects a desire for historical validation rather than evidentiary support. The material record does not disprove the possibility of a war, but it does challenge the confidence with which it has been dated and interpreted. The next section will examine how the collapse of the Mycenaean world provided fertile ground for the retrospective invention or embellishment of the Trojan War narrative, turning it into a cultural explanation for a period of profound discontinuity. The collapse of the Mycenaean civilization in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE stands as one of the most significant discontinuities in ancient history. Once characterized by palatial centers, bureaucratic administration, extensive trade, and monumental architecture, the Mycenaean world disintegrated over a relatively short period. Linear B-script vanished, central authority dissolved, and population centers were abandoned or diminished. This systemic collapse left a profound void politically, culturally, and historically. In the wake of this silence, the Trojan War narrative appears not as a record of the collapse, but as a retrospective explanation imposed upon it. The story may not describe an actual war, but instead serve as a symbolic device to make sense of civilizational decline. The historical record of the Mycenaean world is administrative rather than literary. Linear B tablets catalog goods, people, and religious offerings, but contain no narratives or historiographical texts. There is no Mycenaean epic tradition preserved in the script. With the fall of the palace economies around 1200 BCE, the literate capacity of the region ceased. For approximately 400 years, the Greek world entered a phase characterized by poverty, migration, and loss of centralized control, the so-called Dark Age. When writing returned in the 8th century BCE, it came with a new script, new political structures, and an entirely different worldview. This long interruption created a rupture in historical consciousness. The later Greeks were separated from their Mycenaean ancestors, not by a continuous lineage but by a cultural abyss. The Homeric epics emerged during this process of reconstruction. They were not inherited documents but creative acts of memory, recombination, and ideological projection. In this context, the Trojan War narrative operated as a bridge. It offered a way to connect the present to a glorious, semi-divine past. More importantly, it provided an explanatory framework for the collapse of that past. The destruction of Troy, as framed in the epics, became a proxy for the broader destruction of the Aegean world. By locating the fall of a magnificent city at the hands of a Greek coalition, the narrative externalized catastrophe. Instead of seeing the Mycenaean collapse as the result of internal fragility, systemic overstretch, or environmental shock, the story relocated the origin of destruction to a distant foreign conflict. Troy's fall explained the end of Mycenaean grandeur, while simultaneously preserving the heroism and unity of the Greeks. This narrative mechanism serves a double function. First, It grants continuity. The Greeks of the 8th century could claim descent from heroic ancestors who had fought at Troy. Second, it displaces responsibility. The collapse of the palatial world was not due to Greek failure, but to the natural conclusion of a grand epic campaign. By memorializing this campaign as a foundational event, the epics reframed catastrophe as triumph. The war's duration, alliances, and tragic aftermath introduced moral lessons and cultural values that fit the needs of the new, polis-based societies. Such retrospective myth-making is not unique to Greece. Societies emerging from collapse frequently generate origin stories that reinterpret the causes of disruption. These stories tend to elevate the preceding era as a golden age, identify a climactic event to explain its end, and embed the new society within a continuum of meaning. In this sense, the Trojan War narrative is less a memory of an actual event and more a cultural response to loss and discontinuity. Its timing was crafted to correspond not to what happened, but to what needed to be believed. This need was particularly acute in the archaic period, when city-states were forming their identities and institutions. The absence of historical documentation from the Mycenaean period left a vacuum. Oral tradition filled this space, but it did so by projecting back from the present. The resulting stories were not faithful transmissions of Bronze Age events, but reconstructions shaped by the political, ethical, and theological values of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The Trojan War, in this context, reflects the priorities of those centuries, not of the era it purports to describe. Moreover, the epics do not function as war chronicles. They do not provide dates, logistics, or geopolitical context. Instead, they offer archetypes, moral dilemmas, and existential struggles. These features align better with mythic encoding than historical reporting. Their use of supernatural causality, divine intervention, and heroic fate further removes them from the genre of history. They are stories crafted to explain identity, hierarchy, and legitimacy, not to record fact. If the Trojan War story emerged after the collapse, then its dating becomes a deliberate choice. Placing the war at the very end of the Mycenaean period grants it explanatory power. It becomes the terminal event that precipitated decline. But this placement is not compelled by evidence, it is a narrative imposition. There is no contemporaneous account of the war, no inscription commemorating victory, no palace record describing casualties or tribute. The war exists in memory alone, shaped and reshaped to meet the needs of those who told it. This hypothesis that the Trojan War story was crafted to explain the Mycenaean collapse also aligns with the structural features of the epics. The war marks the end of an era, after which the surviving heroes scatter, empires fall, and divine favor recedes. This transition echoes the actual historical rupture, even if it does not describe it directly. The return journeys of the heroes, full of misfortune and loss, mirror the disintegration of Mycenaean networks and the fragmentation of its population centers. The epics become mythic dramatizations of civilizational trauma. Understood in this way, the Trojan War's dating is a product of ideological function. It had to be located immediately before the historical void. This placement allowed for a seamless narrative arc from heroism to collapse to rebirth. It provided a foundation myth that justified present institutions and identities, but it also meant retroactively projecting a constructed event into a specific time slot. The war's date, therefore, reflects the logic of myth-making, not the findings of historiography. The implications of this reconstruction are significant. They suggest that the Trojan War is not misdated in the sense of being a real event placed in the wrong century. Rather, it may be a symbolic fiction assigned to a particular historical juncture to fulfill cultural need. Its dating is precise because it had to be, not because it was known, but because it was necessary. This necessity overruled evidentiary gaps. archaeological contradictions, and chronological inconsistencies. The next section will examine how, during the Hellenistic period, the myth of Troy was further reframed under the influence of Alexandria and the Ptolemaic dynasty, where religious and political motives drove additional chronological entrenchment. The intellectual environment of Hellenistic Alexandria, centered around the library and museum, represented one of the most ambitious projects of cultural centralization. In the ancient world, under Ptolemaic patronage, scholars attempted not merely to preserve Greek knowledge, but to refine, catalog, and harmonize it with the histories of other civilizations. Within this scholarly ecosystem, the Trojan War became a subject of chronological fixation, not because of new evidence, but because of its central place in the Greek historical imagination and its political utility in defining Greek cultural identity amid a multi-ethnic empire. The Ptolemies, while Macedonian in origin and ruling over an Egyptian population, presented themselves as legitimate heirs to the classical Greek world. Positioning the Trojan War within a definitive historical timeline served their ideological goals, and Alexandria became the crucible where such temporal strategies were formalized. The Ptolemaic regime cultivated an image of itself as a guardian of Hellenic civilization. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a repository but a mechanism of control. It curated which texts survived, how they were ordered, and how they were interpreted. Scholars such as Eratosthenes, Callimachus, and Apollonius of Rhodes were not free-floating intellectuals. Their work was shaped by institutional objectives, state ideology, and cultural diplomacy. This environment produced a specific kind of historiographical rationalism, one that sought to transform the chaotic plurality of mythic time into a unified linear chronology. In this scheme, the Trojan War became a fixed event, both temporally and symbolically. One clear motive behind this entrenchment was religious. The Ptolemies positioned themselves as divine rulers within an inherited cosmology that included both Egyptian and Greek elements. To function effectively as hybrid monarchs, they required a version of the Greek past that was stable and venerable. The Trojan War, representing the culmination of the heroic age, provided a foundation for Greek cultural supremacy. Its temporal placement needed to be secure to establish an authoritative lineage from myth to monarchy. By anchoring the war to the 12th century BCE, Ptolemaic ideology could present the Greek world as not only ancient, but structurally superior to the barbarian civilizations it now ruled. Chronological manipulation served this ideological narrative. The war had to be ancient enough to predate the rise of other empires, such as Persia and Rome, but not so ancient as to lose connection with identifiable institutions and genealogies. The construction of such a timeline allowed the Ptolemaic regime to place itself in the direct line of Greek civilization, as inheritors of Homeric virtue and classical knowledge. It was a political fiction that required chronological rigidity. Another mechanism of reinforcement was literary canonization. The Alexandrian scholars, particularly Callimachus, created bibliographic systems that prioritized certain texts and excluded others. The Homeric epics were elevated as authoritative historical accounts, and their details were increasingly treated as empirical data. Debates over minor inconsistencies in the Iliad were pursued with forensic intensity, as if resolving these points would clarify real events. This interpretive literalism converted poetic elements into historical artifacts, thereby obscuring the mythical foundations of the narrative. Furthermore, the Ptolemies engaged in cultural diplomacy that extended the Trojan myth beyond the Greek world, by aligning Greek heroes with the founders of foreign cities, or embedding them in genealogical lists that connected to other cultures. The regime fostered a sense of global antiquity centered on Hellenism. The war was no longer just a Greek event. It was reimagined as a civilizational turning point for the entire Mediterranean. Such broad claims necessitated a fixed and unquestioned date for the conflict, The alignment of Trojan chronology with Egyptian timelines also played a role. Egyptian king lists, already systematized in temple inscriptions and priestly records, presented a long-standing chronological framework that demanded integration. If the Greeks were to claim historical parity or superiority, their past had to be coordinated with this Egyptian scheme. Dating the Trojan War within a period of known Egyptian history allowed Hellenistic scholars to align the fall of Troy with the late 19th or early 20th dynasties, thus embedding Greek myth within a broader historical narrative that included Ramses II, the Sea Peoples, and the decline of Egyptian imperial power. This synchronization, however, involved interpretive sleight of hand. Egyptian sources do not mention the war or its protagonists. The lack of direct evidence was circumvented through indirect associations, such as comparing military disruptions, attributing migrations to post-war exiles, or drawing symbolic parallels between the fall of cities. The war's placement was justified not by documentation, but by perceived thematic resonance. These analogies were not accidental. They were curated to reinforce the narrative of Greek antiquity and its civilizational relevance. Even the aesthetic representations of the Trojan War in Alexandrian art and literature contributed to its temporal embedding. Vase paintings, sculptures, and epic retellings such as the Posthumerica reinscribed the war into the cultural consciousness as a definitive historical moment. Each representation was treated as if it reinforced the historical plausibility of the event. The repetition of motifs became a form of confirmation, masking the absence of primary evidence with the weight of cultural reproduction. This period also saw the exportation of Trojan themes into Roman thought. The Ptolemies maintained diplomatic relationships with emerging Roman elites, many of whom adopted Trojan ancestry through the myth of Aeneas. This shared foundation myth further incentivized the stabilization of Trojan chronology. The more clearly the war was dated, the more it could serve as a universal civilizational benchmark. Its date became an international anchor around which Roman and Hellenistic identities could orbit. What Alexandria accomplished, then, was the institutionalization of a constructed past. By embedding the Trojan War into a universal chronological framework, it converted myth into pseudo-history and fiction into ideological infrastructure. This transformation was not driven by discovery, but by necessity. The war's date had to be known because it had to be useful. The consequences of this entrenchment extended well beyond Alexandria. Later, Roman, Byzantine, and Christian chronographers would adopt the Alexandrian model, often without questioning its premises. The Trojan War became a temporal fixture, assumed to be real because it had been dated. Yet this dating originated not in evidence, but in the political and theological imperatives of a Hellenistic regime seeking legitimacy in a multicultural empire. In the next section, the focus will shift to the influence of early Christian thinkers and their incorporation of Trojan chronology into biblical world history, further demonstrating how the war's dating was not only maintained, but repurposed to serve theological doctrines. The appropriation of Trojan chronology by early Christian thinkers marked a significant transformation in the war's role within historical consciousness. No longer just a Hellenic or Hellenistic cultural artifact, the Trojan War became embedded in broader theological frameworks that sought to organize all of human history into a linear, divinely guided narrative. In this context, the Trojan War was not merely retained but strategically repurposed. It was aligned with the genealogies of Genesis, the post-Diluvian timeline of the Hebrew Bible, and the larger Christian doctrine of providential history. This integration was not driven by independent historical verification, but by a desire to harmonize disparate traditions into a singular, teleologically ordered past. In doing so, early Christian chronographers reinforced the fixed date of the Trojan War, even as they subjected it to new interpretive demands. The need for temporal integration arose from the central, Christian objective of framing all world events within a biblical cosmology. Thinkers such as Eusebius of Caesarea and Jerome compiled vast chronological tables in which they aligned Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, and biblical timelines. These chronographies often relied on earlier Hellenistic sources, particularly those filtered through Alexandrian systems, including the chronology of Eratosthenes. The date of the Trojan War by then stabilized around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE, was accepted not because of its intrinsic reliability, but because it fit conveniently within the proposed post-flood timeline of biblical history. This harmonization was theological in nature. The Christian conception of time was linear, progressing from creation through key events such as the flood, the Exodus, the birth of Christ toward a final eschatological fulfillment. To maintain this structure, every major event outside the Bible had to be dated in relation to it. The Trojan War, being central to Greek identity and literature, could not be ignored. Instead, it was reinterpreted as part of the Gentile historical stream running parallel to, and ultimately subordinate to, the sacred history of the Israelites. Eusebius' Chronicon, a monumental work of comparative chronology, included the Trojan War as a fixed entry point within a longer sequence of kings, prophets, and empires. By doing so, he effectively canonized its date, placing it alongside biblical events such as the reign of the judges in Israel or the rise of the Assyrian Empire. Jerome, translating and expanding Eusebius' work into Latin, further disseminated this integration throughout the Latin-speaking Christian world. The war became a reference point for calculating the age of the world, the time of the patriarchs, and the emergence of various Gentile peoples. This process had several consequences. First, it converted a pagan myth into a chronological certainty by embedding it within a sacred schema. Second, it universalized the Trojan War's relevance, making it a temporal fixture not only for Hellenic or Roman identities, but for Christian historiography writ large. Third, it sealed the war's date within a closed chronological system that could not be easily challenged without destabilizing the entire theological architecture. The Christian chronographers were not merely passive recipients of Hellenistic history. They reshaped it to serve ecclesiastical priorities. In the case of the Trojan War, they reinterpreted it as both real and providentially timed. Some early Christian authors even speculated about the descendants of the Trojans as part of the divine plan for human dispersion after Babel. In this reading, the war became not just an ancient conflict, but a divinely permitted episode that set the stage for later empires, particularly Rome, which itself traced its ancestry to Aeneas, the Roman claim of Trojan descent, adopted into Christian imperial ideology under Constantine and his successors, further reinforced the war's chronological placement. The Aeneid by Virgil, already a foundational myth of Roman identity, was co-opted into Christian thought as a prefiguration of Rome's divine mission. This allowed Christian intellectuals to retain the war's date while transforming its meaning. What began as a pagan epic now functioned as a prelude to the Christian empire, ordained by God and retrofitted into salvation history. The durability of the Trojan War's dating within Christian historiography is especially evident in medieval chronicles. Works such as Isidore of Seville's Etymologia and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People preserved and reproduced the established dates of the war, often in the form of tables or synchronized regnal lists. The dates were treated as fixed established facts to be incorporated into larger moral narratives. Questions of historical accuracy were subordinated to the need for continuity and order. This chronological rigidity persisted despite growing textual inconsistencies. Biblical and classical genealogies often conflicted. Reigns overlapped ambiguously, and foreign chronologies introduced contradictions. Yet instead of prompting revision, these tensions were managed through theological harmonization. Apparent discrepancies were explained away through allegory, typology, or the assertion of different chronographic eras. The Trojan War's date remained untouched, its position solidified by centuries of repetition, and the imprimatur of sacred history. What emerged from this process was not a historically verified chronology, but a doctrinal one. The Trojan War became a node within a theological map of time, legitimized not by evidence, but by its utility in affirming Christian worldviews. Its chronological placement, inherited from Greek and Roman sources, acquired new authority through its incorporation into Christian eschatology. In effect, the war was baptized not through reinterpretation alone, but through temporal integration. This transformation also insulated the date from critical scrutiny. By embedding it within a sacred narrative, Christian thinkers made it taboo to question the war's timing. Any revision of its date risked disrupting the carefully constructed synchronicity of sacred and secular events. Thus, the war's place in time became a matter of faith as much as historiography. The chronological manipulation evident in Christian appropriations of the Trojan War further highlights the constructed nature of the war's dating. From Eratosthenes to Eusebius, from Alexandrian librarians to Latin theologians, the date was not discovered, but preserved through ideological continuity. It served different masters, Hellenistic rulers, Roman emperors, Christian bishops, but its role remained the same, to organize time in service of authority. In the next section, we will turn to the Roman use of the Trojan War as a foundational myth, examining how imperial ideology relied on the war's fixed dating to fabricate a genealogy that linked the fall of Troy to the rise of Rome, the Roman. Appropriation of the Trojan War, particularly through the myth of Aeneas, represents one of the most significant acts of ideological retrofitting in antiquity. By claiming descent from Trojan survivors, the Romans linked their imperial identity to the mythic past of the Greek world, transforming the fall of Troy from a distant cultural legend into the prologue of Roman destiny. This foundational narrative, canonized most famously in Virgil's Aeneid, required the Trojan War to be not only real, but precisely dated. Its position in time had to be stable enough to support the fabricated genealogy that connected Aeneas to Romulus, the founder of Rome, and by extension to Augustus and the imperial line. The construction of this timeline was a deliberate act of political myth-making, one that solidified the war's chronological placement for purposes far removed from historical truth. The claim that Aeneas escaped the destruction of Troy and eventually founded a Trojan Latin lineage in Italy is not found in Homer. It is a Roman innovation, developed in the centuries following increased cultural contact with the Greek world and refined into a state-sponsored myth by the Augustan regime. For this myth to function as the origin of Rome, the war had to be securely dated, centuries before the traditional founding of the city in 753 BC. The date of the Trojan War, already formalized by Eratosthenes as ending in 1184 BCE conveniently, allowed for a long genealogical stretch, accommodating multiple generations between Aeneas and Romulus. The resulting chronology was constructed backwards from Rome's founding. Roman historians such as Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, under the influence of Hellenistic models, calculated reign lengths, generational spans, and key migrations to retroactively align Aeneas' arrival in Italy with the aftermath of the war. These calculations were not independently derived, but shaped to harmonize with existing Greek chronologies and to reinforce Roman claims to antiquity. The war's dating thus served as the first domino in a cascade of fabricated synchronisms designed to legitimize the Roman state. Augustus, whose rule represented both the culmination and transformation of Roman power, made the Trojan connection a central pillar of his ideology. The Aeneid, commissioned as part of this effort, constructs a direct temporal and moral link between Troy and Rome. Aeneas is portrayed not merely as a refugee, but as a divine agent whose journey westward fulfills a cosmic plan. In this narrative, the fall of Troy is reimagined as a necessary sacrifice that enables the eventual rise of Roman civilization. For this myth to retain its authority, the war's date had to be fixed distant enough to create an aura of ancient legitimacy, yet accessible enough to support a credible lineage. The use of the Trojan War as a chronological and genealogical anchor also served to elevate Roman status in relation to the Greeks. By positioning themselves as the heirs of Troy, the Romans appropriated Greek myth while asserting cultural independence. They reversed the Homeric narrative. What had been a Greek victory became the beginning of Roman greatness. This inversion required a manipulation not only of meaning but of time. The war had to be both a defeat and a beginning, a rupture that gave rise to a new order. Its fixed date allowed for the construction of a historical arc in which Rome emerged as the ultimate inheritor of heroic legacy. Roman annalists and antiquarians contributed further to this narrative scaffolding. They compiled lists of Trojan exiles, Latin kings, and early magistrates to fill the centuries between the war and the founding of the Republic. These lists, often contradictory and fabricated, were treated as historical fact. The earlier the war was placed, the more space was available to insert intermediaries, ensuring that Rome's origins appeared both ancient and uninterrupted. Chronology became a tool of imperial continuity. The implications of this constructed timeline extended beyond Rome. As Roman power expanded, the Trojan narrative was exported across the empire. Provincial elites adopted Trojan ancestry as a mark of distinction, while Roman historians placed the war at the center of a civilizational succession that justified imperial rule. The war's date functioned as a chronological anchor that bound together disparate histories into a single trajectory, culminating in Roman hegemony. The religious dimension of this mythologized chronology should not be overlooked. Augustus portrayed himself as a new Aeneas, destined to renew the world. Temples, rituals, and public monuments reinforced this image. The fixed date of the Trojan War underpinned the sacralization of Roman history, transforming time itself into a vehicle of divine will. This sanctified chronology merged seamlessly with later Christian adaptations, as the war's timing and symbolic value were preserved even as its theological meaning shifted. What is clear from this process is that the war's date was never a product of disinterested scholarship. It was manipulated to suit evolving political needs, from the genealogical ambitions of early Roman aristocracy to the imperial theology of the Augustan age. The war's temporal placement, fixed centuries earlier by Greek scholars, proved remarkably useful for Roman mythmaking. It provided a starting point that required no empirical justification, only narrative consistency and rhetorical power. Moreover, the Roman manipulation of the Trojan War's chronology contributed to its canonization in Western historiography. The date passed from Greek chronographers to Roman annalists, from Virgilian epic to medieval chronicles, becoming a fixture of historical consciousness. Each repetition solidified its authority. The fact that it was entirely speculative became irrelevant. What mattered was that it served as the foundation for a compelling story. The Roman use of the Trojan War demonstrates how historical time can be reverse-engineered to support present legitimacy. By anchoring identity in a fixed mythic past, regimes can construct a narrative of inevitability and moral inheritance. The Trojan War became such an anchor, its date a convenient fiction that gave weight to ideological necessity. The next section will explore the broader theoretical framework of phantom time and investigate how large chronological blocks, such as those surrounding the Trojan War, may have been artificially inserted, duplicated, or distorted across civilizations. The concept of phantom time introduces a radical reevaluation of chronological certainties. It posits that significant segments of recorded history, ranging from decades to centuries, may have been fabricated, duplicated, or misdated. This hypothesis, though controversial, serves as a valuable heuristic for examining how power structures manipulate temporal narratives. In the context of the Trojan War, phantom time theory invites scrutiny into whether the chronological placement of the war was artificially inserted into a historical framework that was later normalized and canonized. Rather than focusing on outright invention, the emphasis lies on reallocation. Events may be real or imagined, but their temporal location is subject to strategic revision. Phantom time theory was most famously articulated by Heribert Illig in the 1990s, who argued that approximately 300 years of European history, specifically between 614 and 911 CE, were invented during the early Middle Ages. While Illig's specific claims are highly disputed, the theoretical model provides a tool for interrogating how time is recorded, duplicated, or elongated. The mechanisms he identified, such as reliance on forged documents, arbitrary use of regnal lists, and uncritical transmission of chronological data, are not limited to the medieval period. They apply with equal force to the construction of ancient history, particularly in cases like the Trojan War, where literary tradition serves as the primary source of temporal anchoring. In this light, the Trojan War's placement in the 12th century BCE becomes suspect. It appears as a fixed point in an otherwise unstable period, a chronological node retroactively inserted to connect mythic memory to linear history. Unlike dated inscriptions or astronomically anchored events, the Trojan War exists only within literary constructs. Its dating is derived not from contemporaneous observation, but from generations of backward extrapolation. This makes it especially vulnerable to phantom time distortions. The war may have been duplicated from other conflicts, relocated to fill a temporal void, or strategically synchronized with politically convenient eras. Several patterns in the chronology of ancient civilizations support the plausibility of such manipulations. For example, king lists from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Hellenistic Greece often contain overlapping reigns, duplicated figures, or suspiciously uniform generational intervals. These features indicate that ancient chronologists did not operate with modern notions of empirical precision. Rather, they constructed time around symbolic markers, narrative coherence, and genealogical justification. When inconsistencies arose, they were not corrected but harmonized. In this process, entire dynasties could be invented or shifted to align with a desired timeline. The overlap between mythic and historical time further complicates matters. Many ancient narratives, including the Iliad, do not distinguish between metaphor and documentation. Events are framed with divine causality, moral typology, and cyclical structure, all of which resist linear dating. When these stories were later historicized first by Greek chronographers, then by Roman annalists, and finally by Christian theologians, they were forced into a rigid chronology that suppressed their original symbolic function. The Trojan War's date was not the result of empirical inquiry, but of chronological normalization. It was placed where it best served the illusion of continuity. The phantom time framework also explains the suspicious neatness of the Trojan War's placement at the threshold between the Bronze Age and the so-called Dark Age. This timing gives the war explanatory power. It serves as a convenient prelude to the Mycenaean collapse and the loss of literacy in the Aegean world. But there is no empirical reason to believe that such a war occurred immediately before the collapse. The association is retroactive. The dating is reverse-engineered from later traditions that needed a cause for civilizational decline. By attributing the fall to an epic war, the narrative transforms systemic failure into heroic sacrifice. This transformation is not a discovery of fact but a manipulation of sequence. Even the astronomical proofs, occasionally invoked to support the Trojan War's dating, such as references to eclipses in Homer or alignments with Venus cycles, based on speculative correlations. Multiple configurations across centuries could match vague poetic descriptions. Selecting one over others requires presupposing the very date under investigation. This methodological circularity is characteristic of phantom time distortions, the evidence used to justify. The chronology is generated from the assumptions. It is meant to validate. Another potential mechanism for phantom time insertion is the duplication of narrative motifs across cultures. The story of a great siege, a beautiful woman abducted, heroic duels, and divine manipulation appears in many traditions. It is plausible that the Trojan War narrative assimilated elements from older, unrelated conflicts, real or imagined, repackaged them into a singular myth. If this synthesis was later mistaken for a single historical event, it would constitute a classic case of phantom time, a composite narrative frozen into a specific date, divorced from its disparate origins. Motivations for such chronological distortions are clear. A well-placed war anchors civilizations. It provides a beginning, a rupture, and a justification. The Trojan War served these functions for the Greeks, the Romans, and later the Christians. Fixing its date allowed these societies to present their rise as part of an ordained sequence. Without the war's placement, the story of Greek heroism, Roman descent, and Christian world history loses its first great act. In this way, the Trojan War's dating becomes an ideological necessity rather than a historical observation. Phantom time theory does not require the fabrication of all events, only the manipulation of when they are said to have occurred. Applied to the Trojan War, it suggests that the event, if real, may have happened in a different century, or that it is a fictional synthesis of earlier and later motifs placed into a convenient gap. The precision of its dating, far from being a sign of certainty, may instead be a red flag. In a period where literacy was lost, records were absent, and oral tradition dominated, the sudden appearance of a firmly dated war is historically anomalous. This section has framed the Trojan War as a case study in the broader phenomenon of phantom time. Its placement, structure, and canonical role within ancient chronology point to systematic manipulation. Whether the result of unconscious mythologizing or deliberate statecraft, the war's date must be regarded with skepticism. The following section will further examine this chronological instability by comparing the alignment of biblical and Greek chronologies, two systems often forced to converge. Despite incompatible foundations, the alignment of Greek and biblical chronologies has long been a contested and revealing process, often highlighting the artificial construction of historical time across distinct civilizational narratives. The desire to synchronize these timelines emerged most prominently in the Hellenistic and early Christian eras, when scholars sought to harmonize the secular histories of the Greeks with the sacred account preserved in the Hebrew Bible. At the center of this project was the Trojan War, whose date had become a chronological fixture through Hellenistic calculation, but which had no explicit counterpart in the Hebrew textual tradition. The attempts to merge these two systems revealed deep contradictions, arbitrary alignments, and theological motives that cast further doubt on the integrity of the Trojan War's accepted dating. Greek chronology, particularly as developed by Eratosthenes, and later adopted by Roman and Christian writers, presents a relatively linear progression from mythic times through to the historical eras of city-states, empires, and philosophical schools. This system is built on interpolated genealogies, standard generational intervals, and key anchor events such as the Trojan War, the return of the Heraclidae, and the First Olympiad. These dates are retroactively computed, dependent on literary traditions rather than primary documentation. Their coherence is the product of internal consistency, not external corroboration. In contrast, The Hebrew Bible provides a divinely ordered chronology that begins with creation, proceeds through the patriarchal age, the flood, the Exodus, and the monarchies of Israel and Judah, eventually culminating in the Babylonian exile. This system is built not on literary extrapolation, but on detailed genealogies, reign lengths, and prophetic sequences. However, the internal consistency of this chronology does not mean it can be easily synchronized with external sources. Its purpose is theological, not historiographical, and its milestones are measured according to covenantal relationships, not secular timekeeping. The first major efforts to harmonize Greek and biblical timelines came from Hellenistic Jewish scholars such as Demetrius the chronographer and Eupolemus, who attempted to place biblical events in relation to known Greek epochs. Their work was later incorporated into Christian chronographers like Julius Africanus and Eusebius, who faced the challenge of merging two fundamentally different conceptions of time. Central to this effort was finding equivalences, identifying which Greek events corresponded with biblical ones. In this context, the Trojan War was often aligned with the period of the biblical judges, or with specific monarchs in Israel, such as Jephthah or Eli. The lack of a direct reference to the Trojan War in the Hebrew Bible created an initial asymmetry. To bridge the gap, harmonists relied on imaginative synchronizations. Jephthah's statement in Judges 11:26, that Israel had occupied certain territories for 300 years, was retroactively calculated to align with the Exodus, and then matched to dates surrounding the Trojan War. In this reconstruction, the war occurred around the same time as Israel's pre-monarchical period, a phase of regional instability, migration, and localized conflict. This temporal overlap was asserted not on the basis of archaeological data or historical documentation, but on theological imperatives and chronological creativity. These harmonizations often relied on fabricated or adjusted dates. The lengths of reigns were compressed or expanded, genealogies were interpreted flexibly, and symbolic numbers were read as literal. Generational lengths were modified to match Greek assumptions, while vague references in Scripture were given forced historical anchors. The result was a synchronized timeline in which the Trojan War could be placed without disrupting the theological order of biblical history. This accommodation was not evidentiary, it was ideological. The motivations behind these reconciliations were clear. Christian theologians needed to demonstrate that all human history, including the most celebrated episodes of the pagan world, ultimately unfolded under divine providence. By placing the Trojan War within the same temporal stream as biblical events, they neutralized its pagan origins and subordinated it to Christian cosmology. The war could then be treated as part of the unfolding of salvation history, albeit in the Gentile domain. Its heroes, though ignorant of the true God, became instruments in a larger divine plan. This theological overlay further insulated the war's date from critical scrutiny. Once inserted into a sacred historical framework, it became difficult to question the war's placement without undermining the larger synchronization project. The Trojan War had been made part of God's history. Questioning its date now meant questioning the coherence of providential time. This conflation of mythic and sacred chronology hardened the timeline against revision. Yet the chronological tensions remained unresolved. Discrepancies between the lengths of dynasties, mismatches between archaeological strata, and contradictions between literary and documentary sources all persisted beneath the harmonized surface. For example, the fall of Troy is traditionally dated to around 1184 BCE, while biblical chronologies, depending on interpretation, place the Exodus around 1440 BCE, early date, or 1260 BCE, late date. Either way, the timelines overlap in ways that require creative accounting. If the Israelites were in the wilderness during the war, why is there no mention of such a momentous event? If they were already in Canaan, How could a massive coalition of Aegean powers wage a decade-long siege just across the sea without any interaction or mention? The lack of interaction between the Greek and Hebrew narratives, despite their supposed chronological convergence, is striking. In a region as interconnected as the Eastern Mediterranean, a war of such magnitude should have generated diplomatic, military, or cultural echoes. Yet the Hebrew Bible is silent. Conversely, the Greek tradition makes no mention of Hebrews, Israelites, or their emerging kingdoms. This mutual absence suggests that the synchronization is artificial. The two systems evolved independently, and their forced merger reflects ideological ambition rather than historical reality. The broader implication is that the Trojan War's dating is a narrative construct shaped by successive harmonizations that prioritized theological coherence over historical plausibility. Its place in time was determined not by evidence, but by its utility in constructing a unified, sacred secular history. This function required it to be fixed, stable, and then concordant with biblical timelines, even if that required distortion. Such distortions further support the possibility of phantom time. Entire chronological segments, including the Trojan War, may have been manipulated to fit ideological frameworks. Whether through telescoping, duplication, or outright invention, the timelines of ancient civilizations were not assembled with modern critical standards. They were composed to convey meaning, justify authority, and assert divine order. The Trojan War's presence within this constructed harmony underscores its role as a tool of cultural convergence. Not as a datable event anchored in empirical fact, the next section will evaluate the use of astronomical data, particularly eclipse records and planetary cycles, as an independent means of dating ancient events, including attempts to confirm the Trojan War's timeline through such methods. Attempts to date the Trojan War using astronomical data represent a modern, methodological effort to extract objective, verifiable evidence from ancient literary sources. These efforts typically involve identifying descriptions of eclipses, planetary alignments, or other celestial events in the Homeric epics, and then cross-referencing them with astronomical software or retro-calculated ephemerides to propose a specific historical time frame. While this approach appears promising on the surface, offering a potential escape from the circular reasoning of literary genealogy or political synchronization, it ultimately proves unstable. The limitations of ancient descriptions, the ambiguity of poetic language, and the circular logic inherent in selecting data points all undermine the reliability of such astronomical proofs for the Trojan War's chronology. The most commonly cited candidate for such astronomical anchoring is the reference in the Odyssey to a solar eclipse. In Book 20, during the suitors' feast and just prior to Odysseus' massacre of them, the text states that the sun has been blotted out of the sky and an evil mist covers all. Some scholars have interpreted this as a literal solar eclipse. In 2008, researchers applied astronomical models to locate a total solar eclipse visible in the Ionian region on April 16, 1178 BCE, suggesting this could be the event described in the poem. Given that the traditional date of the Trojan Wars end is around 1184 BCE, the correlation appeared compelling and was widely circulated. However, this interpretation rests on several critical assumptions. First, it presumes that the passage in question is a literal observation, not a metaphorical or dramatic device. Ancient epic poetry is replete with cosmic imagery, references to stars falling, darkness at noon, divine storms, often used for symbolic or emotional effect rather than as records of real phenomena. In a poem structured around divine intervention and mythic narrative arcs, the invocation of a darkened sky can easily signify doom, divine judgment, or fate rather than a measurable eclipse. Second, the eclipse interpretation assumes a continuous oral or written tradition, preserving such an event with sufficient accuracy for it to be traceable 3 millennia later. The Odyssey was composed centuries after the events it purports to describe and transmitted through generations of oral performance. The likelihood that a specific eclipse, including its date and regional visibility, was preserved with precision in poetic language is minimal. More likely, if the event was based on a memory of a real eclipse, its details would have been generalized, mythologized, or adapted to fit the dramatic needs of the narrative. Third, the method involves selective data matching. The sky, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean, experiences numerous eclipses, lunar cycles, and planetary alignments each century. Given enough flexibility in interpreting the text and a large enough database of astronomical events, it is statistically probable that a vaguely described phenomenon in a poem can be retrofitted to one or more historical celestial events. This introduces confirmation bias. Scholars are predisposed to favor the match that aligns with the accepted date, reinforcing rather than questioning the traditional chronology. Beyond the Odyssey, some researchers have attempted to use planetary cycles, particularly those involving Venus or Mars, to date scenes from the Iliad. These attempts often draw on the ancient Babylonian practice of using Venus cycles to mark calendars, suggesting that if such knowledge was preserved in Greek memory, it could provide a chronological clue. But this approach imports Mesopotamian chronometric precision into Greek poetic culture without justification. There is no evidence that early Greek bards constructed their epics with astronomical reference points in mind. The poems do not function as calendars. They function as moral and mythic dramatizations. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, often cited in broader chronological debates, highlights these problems. Found in Mesopotamia and dating to the Old Babylonian period, this tablet records the heliacal risings and settings of Venus over a 21-year period. While invaluable for establishing Near Eastern chronology, its application to Greek history is indirect and speculative. Some scholars have tried to use the Venus data to realign Egyptian and Hittite chronologies, thereby affecting the dating of events like the Trojan War. But these realignments depend on accepting controversial synchronism, such as the identity of Ashiyawa with the Achaeans or Wilusa with Troy, none of which are universally agreed upon. As such, even when astronomical data is used to stabilize other timelines, the Trojan War remains a dependent variable, not a fixed anchor. Another avenue of inquiry involves lunar eclipses, particularly those used in later Greek historical writing. Thucydides, for example, references an eclipse during the Peloponnesian War, which modern astronomers have dated with reasonable confidence to August 27, 413 BCE. This success, however, stems from contemporaneous writing, clear contextual markers, and verifiable records. The Homeric epics lack these qualities. They are temporally detached from the events they describe, written in stylized and symbolic language, and embedded in oral tradition that resists exactitude. Moreover, even if one were to accept an eclipse in 1178 BCE as corresponding to a passage in the Odyssey, it does not follow that the war itself ended in 1184 BCE. The epics are not chronological records, but mythic cycles. Events from various times may be compressed, elongated, or reordered for narrative effect. The conflation of poetic time with historical time is a methodological fallacy. The eclipse may have inspired the poet, or it may reflect a symbolic pattern common in oral narratives, but it cannot securely anchor the Trojan War within a precise year. What emerges from this analysis is that astronomical data, while superficially compelling, does not provide the definitive chronological verification that it is often claimed to. Its application to the Trojan War relies on speculative readings, circular reasoning, and an unjustified conflation of poetic expression with historical observation. In the absence of corroborating documentary or archaeological evidence, astronomical models cannot serve as independent proof of the war's date. Indeed, the persistent effort to find such proof reveals a deeper discomfort with the uncertainty surrounding the war's chronology. The use of astronomy is an attempt to impose scientific legitimacy on a mythic narrative. It reflects a broader tendency in classical scholarship to seek empirical anchors for stories that were never intended to be historical records. In doing so, scholars risk mistaking precision for accuracy, generating exact dates that are more valid than the traditional myths they are meant to confirm. In the next section, we will explore the enigma of Linear B and Homer's conspicuous silence on this Mycenaean writing system, probing whether the omission suggests a temporal displacement in the construction of the epic tradition. The absence of Linear B in Homer's epics presents one of the most telling and often neglected clues in the investigation of the Trojan War's chronology. Linear B, a syllabic script used for administrative purposes in the Mycenaean palatial centers of the Late Bronze Age, was definitively linked to the earliest form of the Greek language when it was deciphered by Michael Ventris and John Chadwick. In the 1950s, its use spanned the period from roughly 1450 BC to the collapse of the Mycenaean system around 1200 BCE, a range that encompasses the traditionally accepted date of the Trojan War. If the Iliad and Odyssey were composed by or near contemporaries of the Mycenaean world, or if their traditions originated from that era with any degree of continuity. The complete absence of Linear B, or even references to writing at all, should be inexplicable. Instead, it strongly suggests that the Homeric corpus was composed in a later period that no longer remembered or had access to the material culture and institutional knowledge of the Mycenaean palatial system. Linear B was used in major Mycenaean centers such as Pylos, Mycenae, Knossos, and Thebes, and its corpus consists of thousands of clay tablets, primarily related to administrative records, lists of goods, labor, religious offerings, personnel, and inventories. The script was confined to palace scribes and used exclusively for bureaucratic purposes. There is no evidence it was employed for literature, poetry, or even monumental inscriptions. Nevertheless, its very existence signals a highly literate, bureaucratic elite operating at the time the Trojan War is supposed to have occurred. That Homer's epics, which claim to describe that period, contain not a single allusion to such writing, even indirectly, raises immediate chronological concerns. The Homeric world is described as pre-literate. In the Iliad and Odyssey, information is transmitted orally by heralds, bards, and personal memory. Communication between leaders is conducted face-to-face or via oral messengers. Writing appears only once ambiguously in the Iliad, Book 6, where a folded baneful sign or fatal message is delivered, often interpreted as a written letter. However, the reference is vague, metaphorical, and lacks any linguistic or technical description suggestive of a real writing system. There are no references to tablets, scribes, archives, or the institutional features associated with Linear B's known uses. This silence is particularly striking, given the otherwise rich and detailed descriptions of Mycenaean-like architecture, weaponry, and social hierarchies that Homer includes. The likely explanation for this omission is not poetic license, but temporal distance. Homer's world, especially as codified in the 8th century BC, was removed from the Mycenaean era by several centuries. During the intervening Dark Age, writing disappeared from the Greek world entirely. Linear B fell into disuse with the collapse of the palatial economies and left no apparent legacy among the populations that succeeded them. The new Greek alphabet, derived from the Phoenician script, did not appear until the late 9th or early 8th century BCE. This new system was radically different in structure and use, adapted for phonetic representation and suited to literature and public inscription. The introduction of this alphabet coincides with the period during which the Homeric poems were likely first transcribed. This convergence suggests that the oral tradition underlying the epics matured and evolved in a non-literate context. The composers and transmitters of the poems had no knowledge of Linear B or the record-keeping culture it represented. Their reconstruction of the past was not based on textual continuity, but on oral preservation, selective memory, and creative anachronism. The absence of any institutional record-keeping in the Iliad is not accidental. It reflects the realities of the time when the epics were composed and codified, not the time they claim to depict. Furthermore, the kinds of bureaucratic and economic structures visible in the Linear B tablets, centralized resource control, formal taxation, rigid labor hierarchies, are largely absent from Homeric society. Instead, the Iliad presents a world governed by personal honor, gift exchange, and ad hoc assemblies. The contrast between the record-driven palatial economy and the hero-centered values of Homeric society is not merely literary. It reflects the difference between two distinct historical epochs. By placing these divergent cultural systems within the same chronological framework, modern scholarship has overlooked the implications of the documentary silence. Some scholars have attempted to bridge this gap by arguing that the Homeric epics were composed by oral poets who had access to residual memories of Mycenaean society, transmitted faithfully over generations. This oral formulaic theory suggests that institutional memory can persist without writing. While this may be partially true for broad cultural motifs, it does not account for the systematic omission of writing systems or administrative structures that were so fundamental to the Mycenaean world. Oral transmission may preserve battle scenes, divine interventions, and heroic genealogies, but it is less likely to preserve the minutiae of bureaucratic procedures, particularly when those procedures are already lost in collective memory. Moreover, if Homeric tradition had genuinely originated in the Mycenaean period and survived intact, one would expect traces of Linear B vocabulary, references to scribal classes, or even relic concepts of documentation. None are present. The total absence cannot be accidental. It implies that the composers were unaware of such features, meaning that they inhabited a different civilizational context. This temporal disjunction undermines the idea that the epics are contemporary, or even near-contemporary accounts of the Late Bronze Age. Instead, they are better understood as reconstructions of a lost past, filtered through centuries of non-literate cultural experience. This conclusion reinforces the suspicion that the Trojan War's dating is a projection rather than a memory. The war is situated in the Late Bronze Age, not because of continuous tradition or forensic corroboration, but because of later scholarly consensus. Yet the very markers of the Late Bronze Age writing systems, administrative infrastructure, interregional correspondence, are absent from the epic world. This discrepancy demands a re-evaluation of how the Trojan War was temporally located. If the Iliad and Odyssey show no knowledge of Mycenaean literacy, then they were likely composed in a different epoch, and their narrative cannot be used to date the events they describe. This disjunction invites a broader reconsideration of the methodology used to place the Trojan War in time. Reliance on literary tradition, combined with later chronological harmonization, has produced a date that is neither historically verified nor culturally consistent. The silence on Linear B is not a gap to be filled, it is a signal of discontinuity. It suggests that the war, as framed in the Homeric tradition, was reconstructed without access to the material realities of the Mycenaean world. The next section will examine Homer's geographic descriptions and analyze whether the inconsistencies and symbolic topographies within the Iliad reflect a real Bronze Age landscape or a later imaginative geography imposed on a mythic past. The geography of Homer's epics presents another line of inquiry that casts doubt on the historical reliability and chronological placement of the Trojan War. The Iliad and Odyssey contain detailed references to cities, islands, rivers, and distant lands, many of which have long been the subject of attempts at identification and mapping. However, close scrutiny reveals that Homeric geography is not consistently coherent, nor does it always correspond with the real topography of the Bronze Age, Aegean, and Near East. The inconsistencies, omissions, and symbolic abstractions in these descriptions suggest that Homer's landscape was not rooted in first-hand knowledge or preserved geographic memory. Instead, it appears to be a literary construct, assembled from fragmented recollections, regional mythologies, and poetic invention, one that reflects the worldview of a later era rather than that of the Mycenaean age. The geographic references in the Iliad are most pronounced in two contexts: the catalogue of ships in Book 2 and the descriptions of the battlefield around Troy. The catalogue of ships lists over 100 contingents from various regions of Greece, supposedly under the leadership of Agamemnon. While the list has often been treated as a geographic inventory of late Bronze Age Greece, it contains a mixture of known Mycenaean centers, such as Mycenae and Pylos, alongside obscure or anachronistic locations whose Bronze Age relevance is doubtful. Some places listed were no longer significant, or possibly even occupied by the 8th century BCE, others appear to have become prominent only later. The lack of correspondence with archaeological timelines suggests that the catalog reflects a composite tradition rather than a preserved historical reality. Furthermore, the internal logic of the catalog reveals editorial manipulation. The list is structured more for poetic balance and hierarchical reinforcement than for geographic accuracy. The preeminence of Agamemnon's contingent, for example, appears motivated by narrative and political concerns rather than historical fact. The ordering of regions does not follow consistent geographical logic, sometimes progressing clockwise, sometimes grouping distant regions together arbitrarily. This disorganization undermines efforts to treat the list as a factual Bronze Age document. Instead, it functions as a cultural inventory, reflecting the identities and claims of later communities attempting to insert themselves into a shared mythic past. The descriptions of the landscape around Troy further support this conclusion. Homer's Troy is portrayed as a coastal city with views of the plain, nearby rivers such as the Scamander and Simois, and proximate battlefields that change location fluidly across the narrative. While some topographic elements correspond loosely with the Hazarlik site in northwestern Anatolia, others do not. The scale, proximity, and orientation of various features shift in ways that defy literal mapping. For instance, rivers behave inconsistently, mountains appear or vanish depending on narrative needs, and the battlefield is variously described as narrow or expansive. The inconsistent use of directions and distances indicates that the geography serves thematic and poetic functions more than spatial fidelity. Homeric geography is not designed for navigation. It is structured to reinforce moral, emotional, and narrative dynamics. The placement of a river may be chosen for symbolic resonance, such as purification or boundary, rather than actual topography. The sequence of locations in the Odyssey is even more abstract, with islands that shift positions, unnamed lands filled with monsters or gods, and voyages that span impossibly vast regions without corresponding to known maritime routes. Efforts to rationalize Homeric geography by identifying locations such as Scheria, Ogygia, or the land of the Lotus Eaters with real-world sites have been largely speculative and contradictory. Scholars have variously placed these locations in the Western Mediterranean, the Eastern Aegean, or even the Atlantic, depending on interpretive preference. This geographic elasticity is not accidental, it is inherent to the structure of the epics, which draw upon layers of oral tradition accumulated from disparate regions and periods. The result is a symbolic landscape, not a historical one. Another significant omission in Homer's geographic model is the absence of certain major Bronze Age powers. Hittite Anatolia, a dominant force in the Late Bronze Age and a likely interlocutor of any conflict involving Troy, is never explicitly mentioned. Egypt, a superpower of the era and deeply involved in Mediterranean diplomacy, appears only obliquely and mythically. The broader international system so richly documented in Near Eastern archives is absent from the epics. Instead, the Greek world appears isolated, with a narrative universe centered on personal honor, divine intervention, and heroic combat. The political complexity of the Bronze Age is erased in favor of a simplified moral geography. This dislocation further supports the argument that Homeric geography was assembled in a later period. Disconnected from the lived realities of the Late Bronze Age, the map it constructs reflects a mental landscape shaped by oral recombination and regional imagination. Communities that contributed to the oral tradition inserted their own locales into the narrative, creating a patchwork geography of belonging. The result is not a preserved record of ancient warfare, but a cultural artifact of collective memory making. Moreover, the absence of coherent seafaring knowledge in the Odyssey, despite its maritime setting, suggests a limited understanding of real nautical geography. Travel times are vague, routes are inconsistent, and weather conditions change according to dramatic necessity rather than meteorological plausibility. These features indicate that the voyages are not based on inherited navigational knowledge from Mycenaean mariners, but on a different genre of storytelling, one that prioritizes transformation, revelation, and moral testing over spatial realism. The disjunction between Homeric and Bronze Age geography is most likely the result of temporal rupture. With the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial system and the ensuing Dark Age, much geographic knowledge was lost. The epics, when they emerged centuries later, reconstructed the landscape from fragmented memory, oral myth, and contemporary projection. The locations were not remembered, they were reimagined. The Trojan War's supposed setting was not preserved. It was manufactured from the residue of displaced knowledge. This process of geographic reconstruction further undermines the traditional dating of the Trojan War. A narrative that cannot reliably locate its events in space is unlikely to preserve them accurately in time. The mythic geography of Homer mirrors its mythic temporality. Both are structured to support narrative cohesion, not empirical fidelity. The war's place on the map is as constructed as its place in the calendar. In the next section, the investigation will turn to the Anatolian records and the much-debated identification of Wilusa with Troy. This inquiry will assess whether the Hittite evidence supports or destabilizes the Greek chronology surrounding the Trojan War. The debate over the identification of Wilusa with Troy occupies a central position in the search for external corroboration of the Trojan War. Hittite records from the 13th century BCE mention a region or city called Wilusa, located in northwestern Anatolia, often alongside references to a political entity called Ahiawa, frequently interpreted as a Western power aligned with the Achaeans of Homeric tradition. These parallels have led many scholars to propose that Wilusa is indeed the historical Troy, and that the conflicts described in Hittite texts between Wilusa and Ahiawa reflect a proto-historical memory of the Trojan War. However, this identification, while initially persuasive, proves fragile upon closer inspection. The geographic, linguistic, and diplomatic evidence is ambiguous, and the chronological inferences drawn from it often rely on interpretive assumptions that reproduce the very narrative they are meant to verify. The earliest references to Wilusa appear in Hittite texts dating from the reigns of Muwatalli II and Hattusili III in the 13th century BCE. These texts refer to diplomatic relations, treaties, and occasional hostilities involving Wilusa and its neighboring regions. The most famous of these documents is the so-called Toagalawa letter, in which a Hittite king, possibly Hattusili III, writes to a ruler of Ahiawa and references past tensions concerning Wilusa. The letter describes efforts at reconciliation and mentions a conflict that appears to have been resolved through negotiation. Nowhere, however, does it describe a large-scale war, siege, or destruction. There is no mention of a coalition of Greek forces, a 10-year campaign, or the involvement of figures resembling Homeric heroes. The linguistic basis for identifying Wilusa with Troy rests primarily on phonetic similarity. Scholars argue that Wilusa may correspond to W. Ilion or Ilias, one of the Homeric names for Troy. The shift from bulu to silent consonants over time in the Greek language lends plausibility to this evolution. However, phonetic resemblance alone is insufficient for identification. Many place names in antiquity share similar roots, particularly across regions with shared Indo-European linguistic heritage. Furthermore, Wilusa could refer to a broader region or administrative district rather than a singular fortified city. Geographic inferences complicate the picture. Hittite sources locate Wilusa somewhere in western Anatolia, north of the Seha Riverland and west of the Hittite heartland. This description is vague and open to multiple interpretations. While Hisarlik commonly identified as the archaeological site of Troy fits a general western Anatolian location, it is not uniquely qualified. Other sites in the Troad and even further south along the Aegean coast have also been proposed. The absence of specific topographical markers or unequivocal geographic coordinates in the Hittite text renders the identification circumstantial rather than conclusive. The political context of the Hittite records further distances Wilusa from the Homeric narrative. The Hittites describe a complex diplomatic world of vassalage, treaties, and shifting alliances. Wilusa appears as one among many Anatolian polities, its significance primarily diplomatic rather than military. The conflicts mentioned are described in formulaic diplomatic language, typical of Near Eastern correspondence, and do not indicate a large-scale invasion or the catastrophic collapse of a city under siege. The tone and content of the text suggest episodes of rebellion or disputed sovereignty rather than existential warfare. Moreover, the identity of Ahiawa remains contested. While many scholars equate it with the Achaeans of Homer, this identification relies on assumptions about language, geography, and cultural exchange that are far from settled. Hittite texts locate Ahiawa across the sea, to the west, and imply it was a significant power. But the term may refer not to a singular Greek polity, but to a diffuse collection of Mycenaean states or even a single maritime dynasty. Its actual political and military reach is unknown. Importantly, there is no indication in the text that Ahiawa ever launched a prolonged siege of Wilusa, let alone assembled a pan-Greek alliance, even if one were to accept the identification of Wilusa with Troy and Ahiawa with the Achaeans. The historical events described bear little resemblance to the Iliad, the narrative core of the Homeric epic. An extended siege prompted by a dynastic insult, culminating in the sacking of a fortified city, has no equivalent in the Hittite record. At best, the texts suggest minor diplomatic tensions that were resolved peacefully. At worst, they reflect misunderstandings or later interpolations into oral tradition that became magnified over centuries of storytelling. Chronologically, the Hittite references to Wilusa cluster on the 13th century BCE during the final phase of the Hittite New Kingdom. This period is contemporaneous with the traditional date of the Trojan War, ca. 1194 to 1184 BCE, which encouraged the temptation to correlate the two. However, as previously established, this date is not independently confirmed, but the product of literary tradition, genealogical modeling, and retrospective harmonization, using Hittite text to corroborate a date that was itself constructed from speculative sources introduces a circular logic. The texts are not independent confirmation. They are interpreted to support a predetermined timeline. Furthermore, the eventual destruction of Hisarlik's Troy via a layer often associated with the end of the Trojan War, does not align clearly with the Hittite textual record. There is no mention in Hittite documents of the destruction of Wilusa, and the Hittite Empire itself collapsed shortly thereafter, around 1180 BC, if a catastrophic war occurred that involved both Mycenaean and Anatolian powers. It left no comprehensive record in the administrative corpus of the Hittite state, a state known for meticulous documentation. These gaps and inconsistencies suggest that the linkage of Wilusa and Troy, while compelling at a superficial level, is insufficient as chronological proof. It functions more as a hypothesis, an attempt to anchor Greek myth in Near Eastern documentation, than as evidence of a real war occurring at a specific time and place. The association is attractive because it offers a semblance of objectivity, yet its foundations remain inferential. Ultimately, the attempt to use Wilusa as an historical anchor for the Trojan War reflects the broader tendency to seek external validation for literary traditions. This impulse is understandable, especially given the lack of direct Mycenaean or Greek documentation from the period. However, it leads to over-interpretation of ambiguous data and an over-reliance on linguistic and geographic analogies that cannot bear the weight of historical certainty. Rather than confirming the war's existence or date, the Wilusa hypothesis demonstrates the lengths to which scholars will go to construct coherence out of fragments. In the next section, the investigation will shift from source-critical evaluation to interpretive function, asking how the Trojan War has operated as a political myth across civilizations, and whether its role as a legitimizing narrative has contributed to its chronological fixation. The Trojan War, regardless of its historicity, has served as a foundational political myth across successive civilizations. Its retellings have not simply endured through literary tradition, but have been strategically deployed by regimes, city-states, and empires as instruments of legitimacy, continuity, and cultural supremacy. From archaic Greece to Augustan Rome, from medieval Christian chronographers to Renaissance humanists, the Trojan narrative has repeatedly been situated in time, not because of empirical certainty, but because of political utility. The chronological fixation of the war is not a result of historical discovery, but of ideological necessity. Its date functions less as a point of record than as a tool of power. In its earliest uses, the Trojan War provided the Greek Peleus with a shared cultural narrative during the fragmentation of the post-Mycenaean world. As new city-states emerged in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, each sought to assert its own prestige and link to an imagined past. The war became the mythic event around which claims of descent, territorial rights, and aristocratic lineage were organized. Heroes like Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus, and Agamemnon were adopted as progenitors, their supposed descendants founding cities, institutions, and noble houses. These genealogical assertions necessitated the placement of the war in a temporally distant but plausibly calculable past, allowing for the insertion of multiple generations between the mythic and the contemporary. This dynamic deepened with the rise of classical Athens, where Homeric myth, particularly the Trojan narrative, was adapted into civic ritual, drama, and public education. The war, situated in a distant heroic age, became a foil for present moral and political concerns. Its narrative structure, featuring a war fought by a league of Greek powers against a foreign city, was retroactively read as an allegory for unity, justice, or even imperialism. To serve these functions, the war had to be stable in time, ancient, but not too remote. Mythic, but still situated within the flow of history, the utility of the myth continued under Macedonian and Hellenistic regimes, where claims of heroic descent were standardized and institutionalized. Alexander the Great, for instance, visited Troy en route to his Persian campaigns and paid homage at the supposed tomb of Achilles. This act was not a private gesture, but a public statement, a symbolic appropriation of Homeric prestige to justify new conquests. The war became a legitimizing prototype for imperial expansion. Its dating, fixed centuries earlier, allowed conquerors to frame themselves as heirs to a long and divinely sanctioned tradition of Greek supremacy. Roman civilization amplified this logic. By tracing its origin to Aeneas, a Trojan survivor, Rome inverted the narrative. The defeated Trojans became the founders of empire. This inversion necessitated a recalibration of the war's place in time to accommodate the genealogical descent from Troy to Romulus and beyond. As previously discussed, this backward construction imposed a rigid timeline that locked the Trojan War into a specific temporal location. Its chronological fixation was not about establishing a point of origin for Troy, but about securing a mythic prelude to Roman dominance. The date became fixed because it had to support a fabricated continuity. The transition from Roman to Christian Europe saw yet another repurposing of the Trojan narrative. Christian historians and theologians reinterpreted the war within a providential framework, integrating it into the universal history that extended from Adam to Christ and beyond. Here, the war's function shifted again from a civilizational beginning to a peripheral episode in the divine plan, but its chronological placement was retained. It was inserted into tables, chronologies, and universal histories that sought to harmonize biblical and classical timelines. The war's fixed date served as a chronological bridge, enabling the mapping of pagan history onto the sacred order. The mythic function of the Trojan War also extended into medieval and early modern European identities. Royal dynasties in Britain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire adopted Trojan ancestry as a source of legitimacy. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, for instance, traced British kings back to Brutus of Troy, a mythical descendant of Aeneas. Such narratives were not fringe inventions but widely circulated and institutionally endorsed. Their acceptance depended on the chronological plausibility of the Trojan War's date. The war had to be placed far enough in the past to accommodate the necessary dynastic interpolations. Its chronological integrity was sustained not through evidence, but through genealogical need. Renaissance humanists inherited these traditions and reinforced them under the guise of classical revival. The Trojan War was treated as historical fact, its date unquestioned, and its narrative mined for political and artistic expression. Monarchs and republics alike projected themselves into the Trojan frame, using the story to articulate claims to heritage, destiny, or divine favor. The fixed date of the war was essential in maintaining the illusion of unbroken civilizational progress from antiquity to modernity. Across these epochs, a pattern emerges. The war's placement in time is dictated not by evidence, but by function. It serves as a mythic platform upon which each generation builds its own legitimacy. The repetition of this function across cultures and centuries creates a feedback loop. The more the war is used, the more its date becomes entrenched. Eventually, the chronological claim is no longer questioned, it is inherited. The myth becomes history, and the invented date becomes part of the assumed architecture of the past. This process reveals the war's true role. It is a political mythos, not a historical event. Its power lies in its adaptability, its capacity to confer legitimacy, and its narrative utility. The war's fixity in time is not a product of textual transmission or archaeological confirmation. It is the result of repeated ideological investment. Each chronological assertion builds on the last, reinforcing a temporal placement that serves a social function. That function, whether to validate aristocratic lineage, imperial conquest, or theological cosmology, requires stability. A myth that floats in time is less useful than one anchored to a specific century. The illusion of precision masks the absence of verification. The war's dating becomes a cornerstone for a broader architecture of manipulated chronology within Which other myths, genealogies, and events are also arranged? The Trojan War's persistence in political discourse, over centuries and across regimes, has ensured the survival of its constructed date. But this persistence should not be mistaken for authenticity. On the contrary, it reveals the deep interdependence between myth, power, and the control of historical time. The next section will examine other cases of chronological manipulation in ancient civilizations, demonstrating that the Trojan War is not an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of time being shaped to serve authority. Chronological manipulation is not unique to the case of the Trojan War. It is a structural feature observed across ancient civilizations that sought to consolidate political legitimacy, religious authority, and cultural identity through control over historical time. From Egypt to Mesopotamia, from ancient China to early Rome, the construction of timelines was less an empirical endeavor than a strategic act. Rulers, priesthoods, and scholarly elites all engaged in processes that elongated, compressed, or fabricated spans of history to serve contemporary needs. Recognizing this broader pattern underscores the extent to which time itself was an instrument of power, subject to the same mechanisms of distortion and codification as laws, rituals, and myths. In ancient Egypt, chronological control was institutionalized through king lists and monumental inscriptions. The Palermo stone and the Abydos king list, for example, attempt to present an unbroken succession of pharaohs from divine prehistory to the current regime. However, discrepancies between various lists, as well as inconsistencies with archaeological strata, suggest that the sequences were adjusted. Omitted rulers, particularly those considered illegitimate or associated with rival dynasties, were erased, while certain kings were inserted multiple times under different names or ceremonial titles. These alterations reflect an underlying principle. History had to affirm the continuity and sanctity of the reigning dynasty. If actual events did not fit this model, they were reshaped or suppressed. The Turin royal canon further illustrates this manipulation. A damaged papyrus listing hundreds of kings, it combines historical figures with mythical ones and applies reign lengths that stretch credulity. Some entries claim that certain kings ruled for over 1,000 years, an assertion that cannot be reconciled with biological or material reality. These inflated timelines served a cosmological purpose, linking human kingship with the divine order of creation. Time was not measured in fixed units, but imbued with theological symbolism. This approach enabled the pharaoh to present himself as the inheritor of an eternal lineage, even when regime changes, invasions, or collapses had interrupted continuity. Mesopotamia exhibits similar dynamics. The Sumerian king list, compiled in the early 2nd millennium BCE, purports to record the history of kingship from the beginning of civilization. Early rulers are attributed fantastical reigns, some exceeding 20,000 years, and the list is structured to present the transfer of kingship from city to city in a divinely guided pattern. Scholars widely agree that the list served as a political document rather than a historical record. Its purpose was to validate current political configurations by constructing a narrative of divine selection and continuity. In this context, chronology was shaped not by archival evidence but by ideological demands. Later Babylonian chronicles, while more restrained, also exhibit signs of editorial control. Events unfavorable to the reigning dynasty were omitted or reinterpreted, while predecessors were linked genealogically to gods or cultural heroes. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, is itself a temporal narrative that structures cosmic time through divine succession. Its integration into royal rituals reveals the intimate connection between temporal order and statecraft. The king's legitimacy depended on the ability to insert his reign into a coherent timeline that stretched back to mythic beginnings. Historical time was thus retroactively configured to affirm present authority. In ancient China, dynastic records were treated with similar flexibility. The Chinese historiographical tradition, exemplified by the Shiji, records of the Grand Historian, and the Bamboo Annals, often relied on a combination of oral tradition, ancestral records, and cosmological theory to construct timelines. These texts present long reigns, overlapping dynasties, and periodic interruptions that are often smoothed over in the narrative. The cyclical view of history in Chinese thought, where dynasties rise and fall according to the mandate of heaven, necessitated a chronology that reflected moral order rather than empirical accuracy. Events were not simply recorded. They were arranged to fit a philosophical framework of decline, renewal, and destiny. Discrepancies between different versions of the Bamboo Annals reveal editorial interference. Some copies contain inserted reigns, or extended dynastic durations designed to synchronize with other political developments or astronomical cycles. In some cases, rulers appear to reign for implausible durations, or chronological gaps are filled with fabricated events to preserve the illusion of continuity. These distortions were not anomalies. They were systemic features of historiography operating under state sponsorship. Rome, too, exhibited patterns of chronological engineering. The Roman annalistic tradition, particularly in the hands of historians such as Livy and Varro, involved constructing a continuous narrative from the founding of the city to the imperial present. The date of Rome's foundation, 753 BC, was itself a product of retrospective calculation, derived by aligning mythic events such as the fall of Troy and the arrival of Aeneas with later historical benchmarks. The regnal lists of early kings, the lengths of the republic's magistracies, and the synchronization with Olympiads or other Mediterranean chronologies were adjusted to create temporal coherence. The result was a timeline that appeared seamless but was riddled with artificial interpolations. Gaps were filled with idealized events, such as legendary battles, civic reforms, or religious innovations. Periods of internal disorder were reinterpreted as moral parables. The early history of Rome, in particular, lacks archaeological or epigraphic corroboration but persists due to its utility in constructing a Roman identity rooted in order, courage, and divine favor. The narrative required fixed dates, even when the material record offered none. The recurrence of these patterns across civilizations reveals a deeper structure. Time, in the ancient world, was not a neutral medium but a domain of authority. 2. Control time was to control meaning. Chronological claims were assertions of power, identity, and moral legitimacy. The past was constructed to validate the present, and when real events contradicted the desired narrative, the timeline was modified accordingly. In this context, the fixation of the Trojan War around 1184 BCE follows a broader logic of temporal engineering. Its placement served the needs of Greek, Roman, and Christian ideologues alike. Its consistency across sources does not indicate reliability, but repetition, a trait it shares with other politically motivated chronologies. The war's date is not more secure than the reign of Alulim in Sumer or the reign of Huangdi in China. It is an artifact of historiographical construction. This recognition forces a re-evaluation of the methodologies used to date ancient events. It highlights the need for skepticism towards seemingly precise chronologies derived from literary or religious traditions. The burden of proof must shift. Instead of accepting traditional dates by default, scholars must demonstrate that such dates rest on independent, contemporaneous, and critically assessed evidence. In the case of the Trojan War, that burden remains unmet. The final section will synthesize these lines of investigation and return to the core question: was the Trojan War chronologically misplaced? The conclusion will not attempt to answer definitively, but will instead outline the implications of accepting or rejecting the traditional chronology. The preceding investigation has traced the Trojan War through layers of literary tradition, archaeological ambiguity, chronological construction, and ideological adaptation. From Homeric poetry to Hittite archives, from Eratosthenes' calculations to Augustan propaganda, from Christian synchronizations to modern attempts at astronomical validation, the war's place in time has been subjected to multiple, often contradictory, forces of manipulation. The cumulative effect of these lines of inquiry compels a re-examination of the war's accepted date and status within historical chronology. The question: was the Trojan War chronologically misplaced? Can no longer be approached as a matter of isolated literary analysis or archaeological debate. It is a structural problem embedded in how civilizations manufacture time to serve authority, identity, and continuity. The traditional placement of the Trojan War ca. 1194 to 1184 BC emerged not from contemporary records, but from retrospective models built upon retrospective sources. Eratosthenes' chronology, one of the earliest and most influential, was constructed centuries after the supposed event, relying on interpolated genealogies, estimated generational lengths, and an inherited tradition already reshaped by oral transmission and political appropriation. The dating itself became fixed through institutional endorsement, repeated through Roman, Christian, and modern scholarly channels until it assumed the status of fact. Yet the underlying foundations of this dating remain speculative. The Homeric epics, while linguistically rich and culturally invaluable, were products of oral evolution, finalized long after the period they depict. Their lack of reference to linear their mythicized geography, and their absence of references to known Bronze Age powers like the Hittites or Egyptians suggest composition in a later, transformed world. The literary world of the Iliad does not reflect the complex, literate, and diplomatically entangled Late Bronze Age. Rather, it reflects the social structures, anxieties, and ideological needs of the early Iron Age Greek societies. Projecting backward, the archaeological record, centered on the site of Hazarlik, provides destruction layers and material sequences, but fails to match the scale, cause, or composition of a conflict remotely resembling the Homeric account. The destruction of Troy may have been due to natural disaster. Troy may reflect a regional conflict of uncertain scope. Neither aligns convincingly with a coordinated, decade-long Pan-Aegean siege involving major palace economies, nor does either leave behind the kind of commemorative aftermath that such a war would be expected to generate. The material silence is profound and not mitigated by tenuous synchronizations with Hittite references to Wilusa or Ahiawa. Attempts to affirm the traditional date through astronomical references, especially alleged eclipses or planetary alignments, founder on interpretive ambiguity and methodological circularity. Homeric poetry is not astronomy. Symbolic language and dramatic convention dominate, and no celestial description in the epics can be independently confirmed as an empirical observation. When combined with the absence of independent Greek documentary sources from the supposed period of the war, these efforts reveal more about the desire for verification than about the verifiability of the war's date. Overlaying this entire structure is the consistent and pervasive repurposing of the Trojan War across civilizations. Its utility has been evident in Greek claims to heroic ancestry, Roman assertions of Trojan lineage through Aeneas, Christian chronological harmonization with biblical events, and medieval and early modern genealogies of kings and empires. Each appropriation reinforced the war's status and anchored it to a fixed time, not because the date was known, but because it was needed. The war became a cornerstone myth, and myths that confer power are not permitted to drift in time. They are pinned in place, repeated, and protected. The Trojan War's date, therefore, is not merely suspect, it is structurally compromised. It reflects centuries of mythopoeic layering, geopolitical rationalization, and ecclesiastical timeline engineering. To accept the war's date as historical is to accept a concatenation of assumptions, interpolations, and ideological motivations as if they were convergent evidence. This convergence is illusory. However, recognizing this chronological construction does not require a categorical denial of the Trojan War's possible historicity. There may have been a conflict or multiple conflicts involving Mycenaean powers and cities along the western Anatolian coast. Such engagements could have inspired legends that evolved over centuries into the Homeric epics. But any attempt to locate that event, if it existed within the narrow bounds of 1194 to 1184 BCE, must be treated as speculative. The event, if real, may have occurred earlier, later, or not at all. The version we have is a retrospective fabrication, imposed on a historical void left by systemic collapse and oral RECOMPOSITION, that if the Trojan War is chronologically misplaced, the consequences extend beyond a single event. It calls into question the broader framework of late Bronze Age chronology, which often depends on interwoven genealogies, textual synchronizations, and retrofitted dates. It demands re-evaluation of how modern historians handle inherited chronologies from classical, biblical, and Near Eastern traditions. It encourages a methodological shift from passive acceptance to critical disentanglement. Moreover, it forces a philosophical recognition that historical time is not given but constructed, and that myths of the past, once institutionalized, acquire temporal authority independent of their factual origin. The Trojan War may be one of the most enduring examples of this process, a myth with a date, a fiction with a timestamp, a cultural narrative that has colonized historical memory. To move forward, historical analysis must remain open to the possibility that much of what has been accepted as anchored may, in fact, be adrift. The war that launched 1,000 ships may never have occurred as described, or when described, but it certainly shaped how civilizations told time, remembered the past, and justified the present. In questioning its date, we do not erase its impact. We expose the architecture of its endurance. Was the Trojan War chronologically misplaced? The evidence does not confirm the traditional date. It exposes the processes that fixed it. The answer, therefore, lies not in verifying the war, but in understanding why it was dated, and how that act of dating served the needs of power across 3 millennia.